Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
A single lantern was the only source of light in the shop. Two men stood in the center of the room, spilling out broadening shadows across the floor and against the counter and the empty walls. The shorter and heavier of the men, the bearer of the lantern, moved. Shadows swooped, and the floor creaked under his weight. He pushed a box into place, stepped on it, and reached up to hang the lantern from a hook descending from the ceiling. This done, he took a few steps to the counter. He blew a swirl of dust from the glass top and rubbed the surface clear with his handkerchief. "It's only dust, Mr. Bell. If you decide to take this place, we'll have it spotless before you move in." The taller man said nothing. With the light behind and above him only a slight distance over his head, his face was obscured, and his expression could not be seen. The other man continued. "You won't find a better location in this town, Mr. Bell. You have 2 nice rooms upstairs for your living quarters, and a large room in the back for storage or a workshop, and there's the big display window out on the street." "I'll take it, Mr. Lockyer." "A wise decision, Mr. Bell. There's no property in this town more suitable for a jeweler's shop." "I'm not a jeweler, Mr. Lockyer." Lockyer shook his head vigorously and waved his hand as if to brush away his error. No, of course not. You're a clockmaster. You mentioned that. Sorry, Mr. Bell. "I make and repair timepieces. I do not deal in trinkets." "Well, you're certainly needed here, Mr. Bell. You know, if anyone wants a clock or a watch repaired, he has to take it all the way down to Boston. That's a long trip, and more often than not it's a waste of time." "I never waste time, Mr. Lockyer." "Oh, people are going to be mighty glad you came here. And you will be, too. You'll do well here, Mr. Bell. As a matter of fact, I have a watch you might look at when you're all set up. It was my grandfather's, originally. Kept perfect time for nearly a century, that watch did, but last year I dropped it on the stone floor down at the railroad station, and that was the end of it. I took it to the best jeweler in Boston, and those people held on to it for nearly 6 months, and then they told me they couldn't do a thing. It was beyond repair." "Bring it to me." Do you think you might be able to replace the works?" "I'll repair it, Mr. Lockyer. Take it to your office tomorrow." "I will, Mr. Bell. I'll have the lease all ready for your signature. My men will get to work here first thing tomorrow morning. You'll be able to move in by the end of the week." "I'll do my own cleaning and move in tomorrow. Just give me the keys." Lockyer looked uncomfortable. "Well, now, it's always been our policy not to turn a place over to a tenant till it's spotless. I appreciate your hurry, but I just wouldn't feel right giving you a place in this condition. It needs a good cleaning." "I always do my own cleaning. Let me have the keys, and I'll be open for business tomorrow afternoon." "No, you'll never manage that, Mr. Bell. There's too much to be done." "I know how to make the best of time, Mr. Lockyer. Come by at 6 tomorrow, and your watch will be ready." Lockyer entered the shop a few minutes before 6 the following evening. He was astonished at the changes that had been wrought in a single day. The windows, the glass countertops, and the display case were all spotless. The floors and woodwork gleamed freshly polished. The shelves were filled with an assortment of clocks. Some were quite ordinary, others were like none that Lockyer had ever seen before. Bell was not in the shop. Lockyer went to the display case and stooped for a closer look at the clocks behind the glass front. The hours struck, and he was immersed in a medley of sound. Tiny chimes tinkled like tapped crystal. Deep tolling bells and reverberant mellow gongs vied with chirps and whistles and bird-song in a brief fantasia. Scores of figures came forth to mark the hour, each in its own way. Lockyer found himself drawn to the capering figures of a harlequin turning handsprings, one for each of the 6 peals of the little silver bell at the very top of the clock. The figure was smaller than his thumb, yet it moved with supple smoothness, free of the awkward lurching of the clock figures he'd seen so many times before. At the 6th stroke the harlequin turned its final handspring, bowed, and retreated inside a pair of gaily painted doors that shut firmly behind it. Lockyer leaned close, stooping, his hands on his knees, fascinated by the tiny figure's grace. He started at the sound of the clockmaker's voice, and straightened quickly to find Bell standing behind the display case. "I'm sorry I startled you." I was watching. I was fascinated by this. I've never seen a clock like this, like any of these." "You must come again when the hour is striking and see the others. Some are quite unusual." "Oh, they must be very expensive." "Oh, some are priceless. Others are less expensive than you might think." Lockyer leaned down to look more closely at the harlequin clock. He touched his pudgy fingers to the glass of the case in a childlike gesture, and drew them back quickly in the embarrassment. "How much is this one?" "Oh, that one is not for sale, Mr. Lockyer. I've been offered a great deal of money for it, but I'm not prepared to let my little harlequin go." "It's a marvelous piece of work. Everything in the shop is marvelous, and you've set it all up so quickly. It's incredible that you accomplished so much in less than a day. Would you like your watch, Mr. Lockyer?" "Oh, surely you haven't had enough time." "It will keep time for your grandchildren, Mr. Lockyer, and for their grandchildren, too." "Well, how did you do it? The watchmaker in Boston told me it was ruined. He said no one could fix it." "There are very few things that can't be fixed. Perhaps I've had more experience than others." "Oh, it looks brand new. I must admit I didn't think you could fix it." "It was a pleasure, Mr. Lockyer." The smaller man looked at his watch again, held it to his ear, and shook his head bemusedly. He tucked the watch into his vest pocket and reached for his wallet. "How much will it be?" "Oh, there's no charge." "Well, you must have put a lot of time and work into this." "I never charge my first customer." "Oh, you're very generous. Well, you mentioned that some of your clocks are not too expensive, and perhaps, well, I'm sure my wife would be pleased with a nice clock for the mantel." "Then we shall find one to her liking." Bell walked slowly down the length of shelves, paused, retraced his steps, and at last stopped to take down a clock mounted atop a silver cylinder embellished with enamel swans on a woodland lake. He placed it on the countertop. The clock was silent. Its hands were fixed at a minute before 12. It's waiting for its proper owner. Bell touched something at the back, and the clock began to tick. When the hands met at 12, the cylinder opened, and to the accompaniment of a sweet melody, a little dark-haired ballerina stepped forth, bowed, and began to dance. Lockyer stared at the figure in astonishment. "Antoinette!" At the last stroke, the tiny dancer withdrew, and the cylinder closed around her. Lockyer continued to stare for a moment. Then he rubbed his eyes and looked up at Bell. "It's uncanny. We had a daughter. She loved to dance. We hoped that she'd be ballerina, but it wasn't to be. She died of pneumonia 2 years ago." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Lockyer. I hope I have not caused you pain." "Oh, no, Mr. Bell. That little dancer is the image of Antoinette as she was when we lost her." "Then you have your daughter back. Every time the hour strikes, she will dance as she once did." "Oh, my wife would be so happy. She's never gotten over it, really. She seldom leaves the house any more. But that clock, I know it must be very expensive, but I'll manage to pay for it somehow." Bell stated the price. "But that's ridiculous. You could sell this clock for 100 times that much." "I choose to sell it to you for exactly that price, no more and no less. Will you have it?" I will." "Then it's yours." The clockmaster made a quick adjustment at the back, turning the hands to the proper time. Then he took up the clock and handed it back to Lockyer. "It's properly set now. It will require no further adjustment. I hope it brings pleasure to you and your wife." "Oh, it's certain to do that. Thank you, Mr. Bell." Lockyer backed away from the counter, the clock cradled in his arms. The clockmaster's shop soon became a point of interest in the town. School children and idlers clustered outside the window to observe the hourly spectacle. Customers came in increasing numbers, some to bring a watch or a clock for repair or adjustment, and some to buy one of the timepieces that Bell sold at such modest prices. All who entered the shop stayed long, entranced by the marvels of workmanship that filled the display case and lined the shelves. Lockyer was a regular visitor. At least once each week, and usually more than that, he showed up at Bell's shop to report on the remarkable accuracy of his watch, to thank Bell for the ballerina clock, and then to examine the latest product of Bell's workshop. He was awed by the speed with which the clockmaker could create his marvelous mechanisms. Every week brought something new. Late in the year, when Lockyer stopped in the shop for a rainy afternoon, Bell was placing a new clock in the display case. At the sight of Lockyer, the clockmaker smiled and set the clock on the glass top, extending his hand in welcome. "Would you care to see it work?" "Yes, Mr. Bell." Lockyer put his umbrella in the stand by the door and came to the display case. He saw a dark sphere about the size of a cannon ball. It appeared to be of crystal, so deep blue that it was almost black. Atop the opaque crystal was a small white and gold clock no bigger than a child's fist. The hands of the clock stood at 1 minute to 12. Lockyer studied the crystal and could distinguish nothing within but darkness. The clock was exquisite, the crystal flawless. But this seemed a disappointingly simple timepiece to come from one who was capable of the intricate and subtle mechanisms that filled the shop. It appeared Bell had read Lockyer's thoughts. "It's not quite so simple as it appears." Lockyer glanced sharply up in embarrassment. Bell smiled and set the clockwork going. By the time the hands had met, the darkness in the crystal had softened somewhat. At the first stroke of 12, a light appeared at the center. With each successive stroke, a new light glowed somewhere in the crystal, and all grew steadily brighter. The outer lights moved about the central one, brightest of them all. Smaller lights, hardly more than pinpoints against the rich blue that now suffused the sphere, circled some of the outer lights. Silent and serene, they moved in stately procession around the bright center. At the 9th revolution, the lights began to fade and the darkness deepen. When the 12th revolution was completed, only the faint glow at the center of the crystal remained, and then suddenly it was gone, and all within was darkness once again. "Well, that's marvelous. It's the universe." "Only a representation of one small part." "Well, it's incredible, Mr. Bell. Incredible. Those lights and the way they move. How did you do it?" "I have my secrets. I thought you'd enjoy seeing this one, Mr. Lockyer. It will not be here after today." "Are you actually selling it? Who could afford such a—" Lockyer silenced himself abruptly, more embarrassed than before. Bell's dealings were no one's business but his own. If he undervalued his own work, the fact didn't seem to trouble him, and nor did it do him any harm. "I charged a fair price, and the woman who ordered this very special clock for her husband can well afford it." "Sutherland. It can only be Elizabeth Sutherland." Bell nodded, but said nothing, and Lockyer went on. "Well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it hurts me, Mr. Bell. It really hurts me to think of a beautiful piece of workmanship like this clock being in the hands of a man like Paul Sutherland. He doesn't deserve it." "Mrs. Sutherland seems to think he does." "Elizabeth has forgiven him 100 times, taken him back when he's done things." Lockyer stopped himself. He gestured angrily and stood with reddened face glaring at that dark sphere. "Perhaps she loves him, Mr. Lockyer." "Well, if she does, she's a fool. I'm not a prying man, but I can't help hearing things, and if only a fraction of the things I hear about Paul Sutherland and that crowd of his friends are true, well, Elizabeth should have left him long ago." "Things may improve, Mr. Lockyer. People do change." "Well, some people do. I know Sutherland, and I know he'll never change. Not if he lives to be 100. "Well, we must hope." Lockyer nodded impatiently and went to the door. He took his umbrella, put his hand on the doorknob, and then turned to Bell. "Look, Mr. Bell, I'm sorry. I had no right to say the things I said. I got angry for a moment. Elizabeth's an old friend. A lot of people in this town respect her." "Oh, it's perfectly all right, Mr. Lockyer." "No, it isn't all right. That's what troubles me. Sutherland is cruel to his wife and children. He treats his servants brutally, and to think of her giving him something so exquisite." "As I said, we must hope. Perhaps this anniversary present will mark a turning point for the Sutherlands." Mrs. Sutherland arrived late that afternoon. She was a beautiful woman, her fine features almost untouched by time, her thick hair a glowing auburn. But years of unhappiness had left their mark in other ways. Her manner was cool and formal, and there was a tautness in her voice that served as a barrier to all but essential conversation. The sight of the clock changed her. She folded back her veil and looked with unfeigned delight at the motion of the tiny whirls within the sphere. When the last light faded, she turned eagerly to the clockmaker, her eyes aglow, her expression animated. "Mr. Bell, this is a wonder. I've never seen anything to rival it. My husband will be overwhelmed." "I'm happy to see you so pleased, Mrs. Sutherland." "I'm delighted. Oh, it's quite beyond anything I expected, Mr. Bell." She placed her gloved hands on the crystal and looked into its dark depths, and as she looked her expression hardened, and weariness seemed to enfold her like a shadow. When she addressed him again, the barrier was in place. "If by any chance the clock should be damaged, Mr. Bell, we will, of course, take the greatest care of such a delicate mechanism, but children and servants can be clumsy. If some mischance should occur—" "I will repair it, Mrs. Sutherland." This town, like all towns, had its share of idlers and wastrels. Some of them were frequent observers of the noontime display in Bell's shop window, but being the sort of men to whom punctuality was not so much a virtue as an imposition, they didn't become patrons. Nearly a full year passed from his arrival before one of them visited the shop, and he came only to amuse himself at the clockmaker's expense. His name was Monson, and he was given to this kind of amusement. He was a portly, florid-faced man with handsome figures and a confident manner, well-dressed and well-spoken. He belonged to a prominent and prosperous family, though he himself showed no signs of industry or concern for good repute. He came to the shop one morning, spent a quarter-hour examining the clocks on display, and then introduced himself to Bell. "People say you repair damaged clocks and watches." "I do." "I heard you can repair any watch, no matter how badly it's been damaged." "People have been satisfied by my work. Perhaps they exaggerate." "Well, if you're as good as they say, I have a little job for you. It should be no trouble at all for a man of your abilities." Monson drew a dirty rolled-up handkerchief from his pocket, laid it on the countertop, and unfolded it to reveal a jumble of wheels, springs, and tiny bits of metal. A cracked dial and a bent and battered watch case. All were encrusted with dried mud, and the case was scored and scratched. "Too much for you?" "Oh, perhaps not, Mr. Monson." Monson's smile wavered in the face of this calm response, but he quickly recovered. "It slipped from my fingers and rolled into the roadway. A horse trod it into the dirt, and the wagon wheels rolled right over it. I thought it was beyond fixing, but this watch has sentimental value to me, and so I kept the pieces. And then when I heard everyone in the town singing your praises, I told them I'd bring the watch to you and let you show how good you really are." His smile was a mocking challenge. "Come back tomorrow at 4. "So soon, Mr. Bell? You work fast." "I don't waste time, Mr. Monson, neither mine nor other people's." Monson left, and when he joined the friends who had waited for him outside, their laughter could be heard inside the shop. The next day all three came at the appointed hour. 3 other men, all well-dressed and in very high spirits, were also present, having entered only a few minutes earlier. They joined the others around Monson when he greeted the clockmaker and placed his palms on the top of the display case. "My watch, if you please, Mr. Bell." "Your watch, Mr. Monson." He placed a small box on the glass and opened it. Inside was a spotless white handkerchief, Monson's own, as the monogram attested, which he unfolded to reveal a watch in excellent condition. The hands were at 2 minutes past 4. No, Mr. Bell, you must have misunderstood me. I want my own watch, not a replacement." "This is your watch." Monson took up the watch and inspected it front and back. After a time he said, "It may be my watch case, either the original or a damn clever imitation, but even if it is my own, the rest of it, I didn't authorize you to replace the works. I told you to repair them, and you said you would." "I replaced only those parts that were missing. I repaired your watch, Mr. Monson." "Nobody could have repaired that watch. I handed you a lot of junk." "Oh, you did indeed. Nevertheless, I repaired the watch. Do you want it, Mr. Monson?" "Well, of course I do. It's my watch, isn't it? You said so yourself. But if you think you're going to charge me some outrageous price, you'd better think again. I'm on to that trick." Bell quoted the price of his repairs. The men with Monson grinned at one another. One of them laughed. Whether Monson or Bell or the situation in which they found themselves was the source of their amusement was not clear, but Monson didn't appear to share their feelings. He took the coins from his pocket and dropped them with a clatter on the glass top. He took up the watch, turned, and stalked from the shop without another word. Later that week, 2 of the men who had been with Monson came to Bell's shop. They looked over the clocks on display carefully and critically, and finally informed Bell that they intended to buy a clock for their club room at the hotel. Nothing on the shelves or in the display case was precisely what they had in mind, one of them explained further, but there were 3 that might be acceptable, providing the price was low enough. They pointed out the 3, and when Bell told them the price, they gasped at him in astonishment. "What do you mean asking prices like those? There's nobody in this town can pay that kind of money for a clock." "Yeah, I heard that if you like people, you sell them a clock for practically nothing. What's wrong with us that you ask so much? Do we look like fools?" "My prices vary. You saw how little I asked from your friend." "Well, then, treat us the same way if you don't want trouble." Bell did not reply at once. "You gentlemen have chosen 3 of the most expensive clocks in my shop. I have others that cost much less." "Well, if we wanted a cheap clock, we'd go to the general store. We're willing to pay good money for good workmanship, but we won't be gouged." "Well, perhaps I can show you something else. The clocks you selected are very delicate. I may have others more suitable for a gentleman's club room." They blustered a bit, but were mollified by what they took as his apology. He went to his storeroom and brought out several sturdy clocks set in brass and polished mahogany with deep resounding bells to mark the hour. The price of these clocks was absurdly low. The men examined them and selected one. But even as Bell was packing it carefully in a box for them, one of the men looked longingly at the first clock they had chosen. "That clock with the little acrobat is still my favorite. Will you reconsider the price?" "I set my prices very carefully, gentlemen. It's impossible for me to bargain." "How does that acrobat work? That's what fascinates me. I didn't see any wires. I didn't see any wires in any of them. Be damned if I can figure out how those little people operate. What's your secret, Bell?" Bell smiled, but said nothing. Probably just as well for us to get a good sturdy clock and not one of those others. They're interesting, but they wouldn't last long once things got boisterous down at the club. Even a good solid clock like this one may not last long. What do you say, Bell? If someone bounces this off a wall, will it keep on telling proper time?" "If anything happens to this clock, come to me." Elizabeth Sutherland revisited the clockmaker's shop in the spring. Bell was at the door awaiting her arrival, and she waved to him as her carriage pulled up. She entered the shop with the light step of a girl. Folding back her veil, she looked around the shelves and turned to Bell, beaming. "Mr. Bell, I came at a perfect time. You have a score of new creations on your shelves." "I trust the clock you purchased last year is performing satisfactorily." "It hasn't lost a second, and it's such a pleasure to watch. It seems to be just a bit different every time it strikes. The children love it, and Mr. Sutherland is absolutely fascinated by it. He keeps saying that he intends to come here himself and tell you how much pleasure he's gotten from it." "I look forward to his visit, Mrs. Sutherland." "Well, I hope he gets to do it soon. He seems so very tired lately." "Yes, these are busy times. Please, Mrs. Sutherland, have a seat." "Oh, it isn't overwork. He just seems weary. It's almost as if he's gotten much older in the last few months." She was looking up at the shelves. Bell did not reply. He followed her gaze and then reached up to take the clock that had attracted her eye. She leaned closer, examined it, then looked at him and smiled expectantly. "It's a lovely scene, Mr. Bell. So peaceful. I can't imagine what I'll see when it strikes." The hands stood at 2 minutes to 3. The clock face was set in a gold dome that canopied a woodland scene, a still pond surrounded by willows. A rowboat about the size of a child's little finger floated near the center of the pond. In it was a figure in a straw hat, dangling a fishing pole in the water. All was serene. When the first chime struck, the fisherman pulled up a tiny fish, unhooked it, and cast his line again, to land a fish at each stroke. The 3 fish flopped and thrashed in the bottom of the boat. The fisherman took them up and dropped them back into the water. As the ripples spread and faded, he settled in his seat, tilted his hat against the declining sun, lowered his line, and returned to his fishing. Mrs. Sutherland clapped her hands together in an innocent gesture of sheer delight. "Oh, that's wonderful, Mr. Bell." "Thank you, Mrs. Sutherland. Is there any other you'd like to see?" "Oh, I love them all, Mr. Bell, but I'm really here to look for something suitable for my mother's birthday." "Have you a special clock in mind?" "I was hoping you might have another clock like the one I bought for my husband." "Oh, alas, no. Each clock is unique. But let me think. I may have something more suitable." He swept the shelves with a slow, searching gaze, and then studied the contents of the display case. He stood for a time, frowning, a finger pressed to his lips. Then, excusing himself, he withdrew to his workroom. Some minutes later he emerged, bearing a delicate white vase that contained 12 red rosebuds. "A clock, Mr. Bell?" He nodded, pointing to a small dial near the base, its hands at 1 minute to 12. He set the clock going and placed it before Mrs. Sutherland. As the clock struck, a rosebud opened at each stroke, and a growing fragrance filled the air. She exclaimed softly in wonder and delight, "Oh, Mr. Bell, it's absolutely perfect. My mother adores roses. I couldn't give her a nicer present." "I completed this clock only yesterday, Mrs. Sutherland." "Just in time for Mother's birthday." "Exactly on time, it appears." Late in the summer, Paul Sutherland died quietly at his home. He was in his early 40s and showed no evidence of disease, but in his last days he was a shrunken, white-haired man, drained and feeble in body and mind. His widow mourned him sincerely, but there were many in town who counted her fortunate to be free of him. In the fall, on a dark, rainy day of empty streets, Monson and 2 of his friends brought their damaged clock to Bell's shop. Monson stood it on top of the display case and stepped back laughing. The others joined in as Monson pointed to the shattered face. "One of the lads fancied himself a marksman, Bell. How long will it take for you to fix this one?" Bell took up the clock and examined it, turning it in his hands. His expression was grave. "Well, how long? We want it tomorrow. You're a fast worker, aren't you? Too much for you, Bell? If you can't fix it, we'll take another one to replace it. A fancy one of your special models this time." "Those clocks are not for sale." "You're a hell of a businessman, Bell. You don't want to sell your best goods, and what you do decide to sell, you sell at crazy prices. Yeah, he makes enough on the ones he sells to rich women. Is that it, Bell? Yeah, what are you up to with Liz Sutherland? She spends a good bit of time here, some people say. Don't get any ideas about her, Bell. You hear me?" "Leave my shop." "Leave? We're customers, Bell. You're a shopkeeper, and you'll treat us with respect. We want to look over these precious clocks of yours, all these not-for-sale treasures you're hoarding, and you will show us what we tell you to show us." "Leave my shop." Bell's voice was level and unchanged. He put down the ruined clock and took a step toward them. "How about this one?" Monson moved swiftly to the shelves and picked up a creation of gold and porcelain and brightly enameled metal on which a single uniformed guardsman stood smartly at attention. "Don't do anything to upset me now, Bell. I might drop it." Bell's voice was calm and icy cold. "Put down the clock and leave my shop." Monson looked at his 2 friends and grinned and feigned dropping the clock, laughing loudly. At his motion the figure was jarred and fell to the floor. Monson quickly replaced the clock on the shelf. "I didn't mean to do that. You should have just kept quiet, Bell. We didn't intend any harm." "Of course you intended harm, and you've accomplished it." The atmosphere in the shop had changed in an instant. Bell seemed to loom over the 3 men, and they, though all of them were more powerfully built than he and some years younger, now shrank from him. He bent very gently, took up the fallen figure, and raised it close to his eyes. "You can fix it, Bell. Yeah, you can fix things like that easily. It's not as if we hurt anyone. Don't bother about the clock we brought in. It was a joke, just a joke." Monson stepped forward and thrust out his jaw defiantly. His voice was forced and unnaturally loud. "Now, just a minute now. Bell can fix that clock of ours, and there's no reason why he shouldn't. If I did any damage, any real damage, well, I'm willing to pay for it, as long as it's a fair price. We have nothing to apologize for. We'll pay, and that's the end of it." Bell raised his eyes from the broken figure in his hand. I'll calculate the proper payment." The disappearance of Austin Monson and 2 of his cronies was a matter of general discussion and much speculation around town in the following months. Explanations of all sorts, from the ridiculous to the lurid, circulated for a day or two, and then gave way to newer. But as time passed, interest waned, and soon the 3 vanished men were spoken of only by their friends. In the year that followed, Bell's clientele grew to include nearly everyone in town. Even the poorest family, it seemed, could afford to own a clock from his shop. And all of his clocks, whatever the price, however simple or elaborate, kept perfect time. No customer was ever dissatisfied. Bell was always available to a customer or a casual visitor, always willing to demonstrate some ingenious new timepiece. By this time, Lockyer and his wife had become regular weekly visitors, and every week Bell had a new clock to display, even more ingenious, sometimes close to magical. When the hour struck, one might see birds take wing, or porpoises leap from a miniature sea, or bats fly from a ruined belfry, woodsmen felled trees, skaters swooped and spun and cut intricate figures, a trainer put tiny lions and tigers through their paces, jugglers tossed Indian clubs smaller than a fingernail, a sailor danced a hornpipe, a dervish swirled in ecstasy, a stately couple waltzed serenely while a quintet of periwig musicians played, and never were the movements of these little figures awkward or mechanical, but always smooth and natural. No wires or levers or tracks could be seen, only graceful and disciplined motion, time after time. Bell seemed to sell his clocks as quickly as he could make them. Even those that were not for sale left the shop to be replaced on the shelves by new ones. Only a few were permanent. The little harlequin whose acrobats had captivated Lockyer on his first visit to the shop was still in place. The fire-breathing dragon on his hoard of gold and precious gems and skeletons in armor was still in a corner of the window, slouching forth every hour to the terror and delight of all the children. And a trim little pavilion of gold and porcelain and bright stripes of red and blue enameled metal, before which a uniformed guardsman marched and countermarched every hour, while a piper and a drummer marked the beat, stood where it had been for as long as Lockyer could recall, a year at the very least. During the holiday season, Bell's shop was a crowded, busy place, cheerful and lively. Those few townspeople who did not yet own one of his clocks were finally about to make a purchase, and others wished to buy one as a special gift for a relative or a friend. How he managed to do it no one knew, but Bell met the increased demand and even produced a magnificent new clock, a lighted cathedral with carolers before its steps and a choir of angels hovering over its spires. He placed it in the window 3 days before Christmas, and every passer-by stopped to marvel. In the cold, dark days of the new year, the mood of the town changed. No one criticized Bell or his work or complained of his prices. But now the shop was often empty. No customers visiting for 2 or 3 days running. The Lockyers still came regularly, sometimes bringing their infant daughter. They noticed no change in Bell's manner and heard no word of complaint from him, but they sensed a difference that they could not explain to one another. New rumors had begun in the clubroom where Monson's friends still gathered. Here they drank and brooded, and their idle minds dwelt on the still unpleasant disappearance of their own companions. As rumors do, their stories fed on themselves, and interwove one with another, corroborating exaggeration with misstatement, and validating both with falsehood. In time they became firmly convinced of their own imaginings. Bell was the culprit, said the rumor-mongers. Why? Envy, of course. That was plain to anyone who knew the facts. Monson had shown him up, made him look foolish. The ridiculous clockmaker had thought himself a rival for the widow's affections. Fancy a woman like her wedded to a shopkeeper. And when he learned of her preference for Monson, jealousy added to envy had pushed him to desperation. Monson had put him in his place, and he sought revenge. It was obvious. Just what he had done to his rival, and how and why he had included others in his deed, was not clear. Bell was too crafty to leave evidence that would give him away. No one questioned his shrewdness, but he was the guilty party. That was plain to any reasonable person, and he must be brought to justice. At first the townspeople laughed at these wild tales, considering their sources and their probable motive. But they heard them again and again, and in time a tiny seed of something, not quite doubt, but perhaps a vague and reluctant uncertainty took root in their minds. What was said so often, so earnestly, could not be completely without foundation, they told themselves. Not that they believed a word of it, but Bell was a mysterious man. No one would deny that. Where had he come from, and why had he come to this town? How could a man price his wares so erratically and stay in business, even prosper? Who bought those expensive clocks, and what became of the ones that were not for sale, but nevertheless vanished from the shelves? How could anyone produce mechanisms of such delicacy and precision so quickly and yet so perfectly, and still turn out sturdy, serviceable clocks at bargain prices? And if it was indeed true that Monson and his friends had been talking about visiting Bell on the very day of their disappearance, then the clockmaker owed the town an explanation. No amount of good workmanship, not even genius, exempted a man from the common judgment, said the good citizens. The rumors grew more insistent, the issues more troublesome, the questions more pointed as spring drew near. One evening, when the shop was closed and the streets empty, Lockyer tapped at the clockmaker's back door. Bell was in his workroom as he usually was in the evening hours, and he opened the door after a short delay. "Mr. Bell, you must seek protection." "I need no protection." "Oh, you do. You must know the stories that are going around town." "Well, I've heard foolish rumors." "Oh, you and I know that they're foolish, but others in town are beginning to believe them. There's talk of coming to your shop and demanding an account of Monson's disappearance." "My shop will be open at the usual hour. I've always been willing to answer reasonable questions. Will you come in, Mr. Lockyer?" No, I can't. But you must do something to protect yourself. Monson's friends are behind this, and they want to hurt you. They may break in on you in the night." "Will the townspeople permit this?" "Well, no one wants anything to happen to you, but Monson's friends have everyone confused. They have a lot of influence in this town. Well, some of them do anyway, and the people have heard so many stories they don't know what to believe. They're confused." "So I must fear the actions of a lawless mob?" "I'm afraid that's the case. You must protect yourself." "I will, Mr. Lockyer." Without another word, Bell closed the door. Lockyer heard the bolt slide into place. They came to the shop later that night, 11 men strong. Others waited outside, at front and back. Several had been customers at one time or another, and some had come on occasion to observe the clocks as they struck the hour or watch the display in the window. 3 who had been present when Bell had presented Monson with his repaired watch were the leaders. The others did not speak. "We're here to find out what you did to our friends, Bell. We're not leaving till we're satisfied." "Why do you blame me?" "They said they were coming here. We all heard them say that, and then we never saw them again. You're the one behind their disappearance, all right. So just admit it, Bell. We can make you tell us everything if you force us to." One of the others raised a walking stick and tapped it on the glass top of the display case. "We can smash this place to bits, and you with it. Now tell us what you did to our friends." Bell looked down at him, then at the man with the walking stick, then at such others as met his glance. He raised his hand and pointed to the door. "It's best that you leave my shop. Best for you, that's certain, but we're not leaving." Several of the others, under the challenge of his ferocious gaze, murmured their agreement. "Don't try to bluff us, Bell. You've bluffed this whole town for too long. Answer our question or it's going to get mighty Answer our questions or it's going to get mighty unpleasant." He brought his stick down sharply. The glass cracked. Then, suddenly, at exactly 9 minutes past the hour of 1, all the clocks in the shop began to strike in unison. Deep gongs and crystalline chimes, resonant bells, and the sound of tiny drums and trumpets, and a din of indistinguishable pealings and tolling and clanging, all blended to engulf the intruders in a wave of sound. And on they struck, 12 times and 12 more, and 12 times 12 more, rapidly at first, and then steadily diminishing in volume and rapidity, fading as if they were receding at a steady rate, becoming even fainter until they could be heard no more. The men stood, benumbed by the assault of sound. They felt no pain and sensed no restraint by external force. Not one of them carried any trace of physical harm as a result of that night. Their breath came freely, they could move their eyes and hear every sound. But their bodies were held as if the air had grown viscid, and glutinous, clinging to them, dragging at them like thick mud or heavy snow, but 1,000 times more inhibitive than mud or snow, because, invisible and insensible as it was, it clung not only to their feet and legs, but to their hands, arms, heads, and bodies. They felt as if time itself had crawled almost to a halt, congealing and trapping them within it like insects in amber. Those who spoke of that night, and few of them ever did so, and those few reluctantly after long silence and still fearful of ridicule, agreed on several points. Bell, they all said, was untouched by the phenomenon. He removed the clocks from the shelves and the window and the display case, one by one, carefully and lovingly, and took them into his workroom. This process took some time, several hours at least, but none of the men felt the pain or cramping that such a long period of enforced immobility or near immobility would be certain to cause. Bell worked methodically, ignoring the intruders, his attention confined to his clocks. On these facts all agreed, but each had his own particular memory of that night. According to one man, the shop grew steadily darker. Another said that the light remained constant, but Bell himself moved ever more swiftly, until at last he moved too fast for the eye to follow and vanished from sight. A third man claimed that Bell grew more insubstantial and wraith-like with each timepiece he removed, and at last simply faded into nothingness. One man recalled a sight of a fly that passed before his face so slowly that he could count the beats of its wings. The fly progressed no more than a foot, and yet the man swore that its passage consumed 3 hours at the very least. One of his companions spoke of the disturbing sight of ash fallen from the cigar in the hand of a man standing near him. It fell to the ground so slowly that in all the time he stood confined, no less than 4 hours by his calculation, it had not reached the floor. 2 other men mentioned their awareness of each tick of a clock, separated by an agonizing interval. One claimed a full hour's space, while the other spoke only of a horrible long wait between one tick and the next. Whatever happened on that night, however it happened, when the men could move, and their immobility ended in an instant, without warning, Bell and all the clocks were gone. 5 men fled the shop in terror the instant they had command of their legs. Those who remained did so more from fear of showing fear than from courage or even anger. They looked to one another uncertainly, awaiting direction, and finally someone said, "We have to go after him." The workroom was dark and empty. They drew the bolt on the back door, and one shouted to the other waiting outside, "Did you see him?" A man carrying a pick-handle emerged from the shadows. "Didn't see nobody. Nobody's come out that back door." "Are you sure?" "Well, of course we're sure, damn it. What happened? Bell get away from you?" They didn't reply. They returned to the shop, and noticed something that had escaped them in the first shock of freedom. The shop was thick in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling and rounded the upper corners of the shelves. The air was stale like that of a room long sealed. As they looked around them, the clock in the town hall struck the quarter hour. One man looked at his watch and announced in a hushed voice, 1:15. No one ever learned what became of the clockmaker. No clocks like his were ever seen again by any of the townspeople, even those who traveled widely and took an interest in such things. Those that he sold have been passed on through 3 or 4 or even 5 generations. They keep perfect time and have never required repair.
Six Crows. Written by Daniel Davis. Narrated by Jeff Clement.
There were 6 crows in that telephone wire.
Rick glanced at his wife, who still had her face pressed against the passenger side window. What?
On that telephone wire back there. There were 6 crows.
Rick struggled for something to say, a witty comment or resentful retort. Instead, he grunted and returned his attention to the road. After a few seconds, Marie looked at him.
Did you hear me?
You mean about the crows?
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard you.
Don't you think that's odd?
Rick tried to find something in her eyes, some proof that she was baiting him, some sign that she was trying to make him look like a fool in front of their daughter again. What he saw made him frown. Marie looked worried. What's wrong?
There were 6 crows on that telephone wire.
She repeated. Rick swallowed, turned back to the road, and watched as one telephone pole replaced another. He felt Marie's stare, but not the way she used to look at him. In the beginning, it had been sexy. Now it was annoying. Carefully, he said, I don't get it.
Didn't you ever hear the rhyme?
Apparently not.
My grandmother taught it to me when I was little, and she learned it when she was little, back in England. I don't remember it exactly, but it said something like different numbers of crows meant different things. Like 3 crows would mean good luck or something.
Does 6 crows mean we win the lottery? In the back seat, Chelsea giggled. Rick glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Thanks, honey. Daddy loves to have an audience.
Rick.
Yes, dear?
6 crows are unlucky. Very unlucky.
Uh-huh. Rick didn't have to fight back to laughter. After 7 years, he simply knew better than to laugh.
That was the 4th grouping of 6 crows that I've seen in the past hour.
Good thing it wasn't the 6th group. Then we'd really be screwed.
You don't think that's a little disturbing?
Marie, what I think is that your powers of observation are astounding. You managed to count how many crows were grouped together on a telephone wire while passing them at 60 miles per hour. Not only that, but I didn't even see the damn things.
Are you saying I imagined it?
He couldn't help himself. No, I'm saying only you would care.
Rick.
She let her voice trail off. The one good thing about their marriage, they had learned when to pick their fights. Whenever Chelsea was around was not an appropriate time. Still, their daughter could sense when something was wrong. In the rearview mirror, Rick saw Chelsea facing out the window, her eyes squinted. He knew how awkward it was trying to distance herself from the tension in front of her. He remembered feeling that way as a kid. It had been hell. Returning his attention to the road, Rick wondered how much further they had to go before they got out of Nebraska. The Atlas was in the back seat, highways highlighted in orange and pink, indicating an intricate pattern across the country. Perhaps the scenic drive hadn't been the best choice. It was taking far too long, and the Rockies wouldn't be in sight for another day or 2 at least. The interstate wouldn't have offered as many interesting detours, just the typical tourist destinations, but it would have gotten them there quicker and more efficiently. Rick found the 2-lane highways, at least during the stretches through fields of wheat, corn, and hay, boring. He felt drowsy and out of it. In a couple hours, he had to turn the wheel over to Marie, who was, if nothing else, a competent navigator. At least the weather was in their favor. 2 days earlier, they had found themselves driving through a severe thunderstorm. Chelsea had been in tears, worried about tornadoes. Rick had placed the idea in her head and spent most of that hour mentally berating himself for it. Marie had to pull over, give the wheel over to Rick, and climb into the back with their daughter. She hadn't chewed Rick out that time. They'd both known it had been his fault. Marie had always been an artist with guilt. She knew when to lay it on and when to let it creep up at its own pace. The day was pleasant. Perhaps that was because the car was air-conditioned. Rick had experienced some horrible summers on the East Coast, but nothing prepared him for the barrenness of the Midwest. There were no trees, hills, or skyscrapers to block the sun. The heat was not a byproduct of the sunlight. It was the sunlight, unfiltered and uncompromising. The grass could take it. The grass and wheat were light enough to catch what little breeze blew across the fields, to sway in its brief reprieve.
But a man standing out there would feel nothing but the blistering heat.
We're in the middle of God's asshole, Rick thought, laughing. Marie's grandmother had been good for more than counting crows. She'd been a delightful dinner table conversationalist, with enough witticisms to start her own quotations dictionary.
What's so funny?
Marie asked. Rick noted that there was no hostility in her voice, only mild curiosity. Nothing, he said. He just got me thinking about Helen. Marie smiled.
You hear that, Chelsea? Daddy's thinking of Grandma Miller.
Grandma Miller,
Chelsea said in a low, throaty growl, an imitation of a voice roughened by too many cigarettes. That'd be her, Rick said. She of the varicose veins and halitosis.
what's that?
You'll find out in a few years, sweetheart.
We'll also have to
Discuss hernias, hemorrhoids, crow's feet. Instantly, Rick regretted what he said. He glanced carefully at Marie. Yes, the amusement was gone from her face, but her smile remained. Do you remember her chicken and dumplings? Rick asked, rushing the words out faster than he should have. Good Lord, I could have lived off them,
And her banana cookies.
Chelsea said from the back seat. Yeah, those too. And her raspberry pie, Rick added, smiling. Marie winced.
Ew.
Hey, you liked it,
I pretended to like it to make her happy.
Marie said. I call BS, dear. You ate it with gusto. You stopped liking it when you tried out the recipe, Rick told her.
She always said the main ingredient was love.
Doesn't mean you should skimp on the salt,
I just thought we should try eating a little healthier.
Marie said.
You didn't like the spare tire you were getting, remember?
Sorry I don't make enough to afford a gym membership.
Daddy, what's that?
Rick glanced into the rearview mirror. Chelsea was pointing at the windshield. He looked forward. Rick slammed on the brakes at the sight of something shiny in the middle of the road. Shit! Rick jerked the steering wheel to the right. The Toyota refused to turn with him. The car left the road, hit the gravel, and then drove headfirst into the ditch that separated the highway from the fields. The car came to a halt, the back bumper a couple of feet higher than the front. Rick stared out the windshield at the tall grass just a few feet in front of him, swaying back and forth. Damn it! He put the car in reverse. The wheels spun.
Rick,
He tried again. God damn it!
Rick!
He glanced at his wife. She placed a tentative hand on his shoulder.
Honey, turn the car off.
He stared at her for a moment, then did as she asked. He couldn't think of anything else to do. Marie unbuckled her seatbelt.
Chelsea, honey, are you all right?
Mommy.
Rick ripped his seatbelt out of the buckle and turned around. Chelsea appeared to be okay. She was frightened, more so than she had been a couple days ago during the storm, but otherwise unharmed. Comfort was Marie's department. His wife had always been good with that. What the fuck was that?
Rick!
Jesus, I'm sorry. Marie, who had climbed into the back seat with their daughter, glared at him over Chelsea's tangled blonde hair.
I don't know what it was. Maybe you should have been watching the road?
Chelsea's crying kicked up a notch. Rick focused his attention at the hayfield. A retort sat at the tip of his tongue, but she was right. He should have been watching the road. He wiped sweat from his face, and as he did, he noticed stubble grating against his palm. He took off his glasses and rubbed his temple. He racked his mind, trying to figure out what he could do. Rick turned the car on, and immediately cool, brisk relief filled the vehicle. He angled a vent directly on his face. He needed a second to cool off and collect his thoughts. After a few moments of silence, Rick calmed down, Chelsea's sobs subsided, and Marie's panting slowed, though he still felt her stare. The argument would be moved until later, reserved until they checked into the next motel. That suited him just fine. He looked in both side view mirrors, trying to see the object he'd run over. All he saw, though, was sky. "I should check how bad it is," he said. "See what we hit." Marie didn't say anything. By the way her jaw clenched, he could tell she'd wanted him out of the car. He couldn't blame her. Rick opened the door and stepped out, falling a few more inches than he expected. The heat didn't hit him as much as engulf him. As soon as he was outside the Toyota, the air conditioning became a distant memory. The sun, beating down on him with no clouds to absorb the blow, became everything. He shut the door behind him, purposely refusing to look into the back seat, as he checked to make sure none of the tires had blown, then scrambled up the ditch and onto the highway. The object that had caused him to derail the trustworthy Toyota lay a few yards down the highway. Rick shambled over to it. He stared at the object, cocking his head to the side, trying to figure out what it was. Some piece of metal, maybe from a tire or muffler. Awful shiny muffler, he thought. It wasn't anything, just an anonymous piece of thin metal, a few inches long, with one sharp end. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and threw it into the field. Fuck it, he thought as he walked back to the car. Marie rolled the window down in the back.
What did we hit?
We didn't. Thank God.
Well, what was it?
Rick shrugged. She rolled the window back up and turned back to their daughter. He stood at the back of the car, thinking about how hot it was and how tired he was from driving. He knew he would have to push the car on top of everything else. To that purpose, he hollered to Marie, "Pop the trunk." She did, and he began taking out their suitcases and setting them safely aside. He didn't know if it would help at all, probably not, but it gave him something to do while he prepared himself for the labor ahead. Once the trunk was emptied, he slammed it shut and walked back to the driver's side. As he climbed into the car, the air conditioning caressed his skin. His sweat dried almost instantly, leaving him shivering. Rick relished every second of it, leaning back in the seat, eyes closed.
Everything okay?
Marie asked. He opened his eyes as if waking from a deep sleep. Part of him hoped to see the road, a gas station, or a hotel. Instead, all he saw out his windshield was hay. He turned around in his seat. Marie was no longer holding their daughter. Chelsea sat beside her, flipping through one of the books she'd brought. Her eyes scanned the page intently. Rick felt a moment of pride watching his daughter read, thinking perhaps she may even become an English teacher like him, although hopefully she'd wind up someplace more prestigious than Clarkview Middle. His eyes shifted from his daughter to Marie, who glared at him with furrowed brows.
What are we going to do?
I need to push this car out of the ditch.
Can you do that?
If you're sitting here with it in reverse, yeah, probably.
Can't you just call a tow truck?
I thought you said we don't have any reception out here. She sighed.
The phone's there, beside you. Check.
Rick picked up the phone. No signal.
There's gotta be a farmhouse around here.
He coughed. Want to get out there and search for it? Probably miles down the road either way.
How about flagging someone down?
How many cars do you remember us passing?
I don't know.
You can count crows, but not cars. I counted 4. That's 4 in the past 2 hours. This isn't a highway so much as it is a skid mark. We're alone out here. She smiled at him.
It's scenic though, isn't it?
Maybe Chelsea can go up the road and see if she can wave down a busload of cheerleaders or something. Chelsea giggled.
Okay, Daddy.
Rick smiled. The 3 of them stepped outside the car. Marie gasped in the heat. Rick was surprised how much his body seemed to have forgotten it so quickly. We ain't in Kansas anymore, though it looks about the same. As Chelsea disappeared over the hill, Rick called out, "Make sure you ask those cheerleaders if they have any beer with them."
Okay.
She called back down, laughing. Marie turned to him. Out there in the sun, she looked her age. Not that she was old, neither of them were old, but she wasn't a young co-ed anymore either. She didn't have a 20-year-old's body or grace. Certainly no college girl had those crow's feet. The sunlight seemed to highlight the creases in her face, the imperfections in her skin. He figured it was doing the same to him, an equal opportunity humiliation. She pulled her hair back and let it fall limp against her shoulders.
God, it's hot.
You said it, Rick agreed. Marie looked up the road.
She's okay up there, right?
She's better than us, he nodded. We've got work to do. When I pound on the hood, throw it in reverse. Don't stomp on the pedal. Just let it down gradually. I want to see how this thing's going to react. Marie got in and closed the door. Rick heard the soft purr of the automatic window rolling down as he walked to the front of the car. He leaned against the hood, putting some force into it. The car rocked. The push would take a lot of time, and he would be far too exhausted to drive to the next town. Marie could, though, assuming that there even is a town. Of course there's a town, he muttered.
Ready?
She asked. Sorry, this fucking heat. Remember, when I pound on the hood, throw her in reverse.
I was paying attention.
Amazing the patience you learned after 7 years of marriage. They'd been together 2 years before that, but patience had never really been a part of their relationship. They'd been too busy with school and sex. There had been love, of that he had no doubt. But love had complicated things. The first year of marriage hadn't been much different. They'd lived together before tying the knot, so they became accustomed to each other's bad habits. Even when the baby came, things had been going strong. When had it gone downhill? After the move? Clarkview wasn't the city. They had agreed the city wasn't the place to raise Chelsea. That was one of the few things they still agreed on. But Clarksville wasn't exactly the suburban life that Marie had in mind. Maybe they would have been happier elsewhere. Rick couldn't come up with a specific moment when he realized his marriage was ending. It was as though he'd always known it, which wasn't true at all. As a kid, watching his parents' marriage fizzle, then explode, he'd promised he would never do the same thing. He would marry for life. And he had. He really had.
He got his mind trailing, wiped sweat from his forehead, and slammed his palm onto the hood.
After he heard the engine accelerate, he pressed his shoulder against the front grille. Marie put the car in reverse and revved the engine. The car moved an inch or two, but quickly settled back into place. Marie leaned out the window.
You okay?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Just give me a second.
You really think you can push this thing up from here?
Yeah, I can do it. Rick pounded on the hood and placed both hands against the grill of the car, wincing at the radiating heat. He pushed hard as Marie revved the engine, and the car moved a few inches, enough for him to step forward. He pushed again until his foot slipped in the grass and he fell. "Fuck!" he yelled as his cheek contacted the hot steel. Rick slid to the ground, grateful he didn't pull anything on his way. He rested against the bumper, breathing heavily.
You okay?
"I'm all right." "One more go?" he said as he stood and prepared to push once more. It actually took 3 more tries. Inch by inch, they maneuvered the vehicle into a better position. By the end of it, Rick stripped his shirt off and was covered in sweat and grime. Marie reversed the car the rest of the way from the ditch until the tires finally took hold and the car jerked backwards. As he climbed the small incline, Rick fell again, but this time softly into grass and dirt. Rick heard Marie exit the car and call for him again. Between the sun and the exhaustion from pushing, he wanted to lie there. But there was something different in the way she called his name. He sat up, waiting for her to come to his side of the road. "What is it?"
Where's Chelsea?
He stood and looked around. "She's not with you?" Marie's voice became panic-stricken.
Why the hell would I ask where she was if she was with me?
He watched her march toward the opposite side of the road and looked back. He stopped himself from running after her. Running would mean there was a reason to run. Once on the road, he saw Marie a few yards away, pacing back and forth across the highway, looking down the other side. "Chelsea?" Rick yelled.
Chelsea?
Marie repeated. Marie turned back to him, wild-eyed. They both took turns calling out Chelsea's name without a response. Finally, Marie snapped.
Rick, where is she?
Tears streamed down her face. "She was here!" Rick screamed. "She was right fucking here! Chelsea!"
Come here right this instant!
Panic won. Rick ran, rechecking everywhere, his eyes following the path of the hay.
Did she get back in the car?
Marie asked, hopeful. The car. Yes, she had to be in the car. He hadn't heard her climb back inside, but then he'd been exerting himself, pushing it out of the ditch. He hadn't heard the door open, that's all. Hadn't heard it close either. He simply hadn't noticed. And neither had Marie, but she'd been caught up in what they were doing too. They both took off in a run. Marie flung open the passenger door, screaming.
Chelsea?
Rick watched her lift her hands to her mouth and step back from the car.
Oh my God.
What? He ripped open the opposing door.
She's not here.
Rick opened the trunk and dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain that shot up as the hot pavement raised his skin. She wasn't under the car either.
Chelsea Elizabeth Palmer, you come here right now!
Marie yelled, fists balled to her sides. "Chelsea!" Rick took a deep breath and yelled again. "Chelsea!" He ran back into the middle of the road. No sign of her.
Rick!
The tone of her voice changed again. "What?" he said as he took a step towards her.
Look!
Rick followed where her fingers pointed, expecting to see Chelsea pop out of the grass, but instead, his eyes rested on a telephone pole with birds perched along the wires. Crows. He counted 6. 6 crows. "God damn it, Marie!" Rick lashed out, furious.
Rick, that rhyme!
He had to slow down before he lost his mind. His gaze shifted from the crows to the grass below. Rick's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward. Behind him, he heard her mumbling something, but he ignored it and moved on a little faster. There was a break in the hay, small but still visible. The edge was distorted as if something had broken through. After a moment of staring, he comprehended what he was looking at. A hole in the dried grass. And he saw something else, too. Rick ran, stumbling down the ditch and landing on his knees in front of the hay. Marie was immediately behind him. They both stared, but not at the hole. Rather, what was in it and all around the hole.
What's that?
She asked, her voice trembling. Rick didn't answer. He continued to stare at what he knew was blood. It's not hers. We're in the country. That blood could belong to anything. Except they were alone out here. And the blood was fresh. They moved towards the small entrance. Marie dropped down to her knees beside him. Rick barely noticed. He stared hard into the hole, noticing how it seemed like someone had been dragged into it. Signs of a struggle. The words resonated in his head for a moment. And then it all clicked. Chelsea's in there. If she's bleeding, she's alive. Rick pushed Marie aside and broke into a run. He parted the tall grass as he took each long, hard step. It was easy to tell where she'd been. The hay grass was trampled, disorderly, unkempt. There was a trail, a path cut through the field, more or less straight on. Worse than anything, he followed a path of blood, left like a trail of breadcrumbs. He didn't see Chelsea anywhere. He thought about going back for some kind of weapon, but he had already wasted enough time. Marie gasped from somewhere behind him. She tried to keep up, but he forged on without waiting. "I'll get her," he said, hoping she would have the wits to turn back and flag someone down. This can't be happening. Rick thought clearly enough to know that despite his panic, despite the time he was losing, he needed to move carefully. If he ran too fast, he might lose track of the path. He went on, one long stride in front of the other. Grass brushed at his arms, face, and chest. A grove of trees, 100 or so yards away, caught his attention. He couldn't tell from that far back, but figured it was where the trail led. That's where she would go, or whoever, whatever, had her wood. It was the only thing out there besides the goddamn highway. Thoughts berated his mind, trying to loop him into a panic. He imagined worst-case scenarios, but he fought past it as he cut through the grass, still following the blood trail. He pushed on, the clearing not far. Tears stung his eyes. He stopped for a second to listen. Marie was stumbling through the trail, crying. Flies buzzed around his ears. Beetles crawled on his shorts and legs.
One crow is unlucky.
Marie's voice came from behind him. Rick tried to ignore her and started moving a little faster than before. He followed the path, each blade of grass splattered by a painter's brush. Rick wondered how much blood Chelsea had in her. Then he wondered why he would even think such a thing.
2 crows. Lucky.
He heard her say. She was on his heels now. He sped up, the clearing not much further. He tried not to notice her. He tried hard to ignore her words.
3 is health,
she said louder. Between the blood, heat, and Marie losing her mind, panic won.
4 is wealth.
Her ragged voice screamed. Running was illogical. He needed to slow down. He needed to think, he needed to conserve his strength, but logic was a thing of the past. Logic did not belong beneath a sun that knew neither joy nor pity. Logic belonged in the air-conditioned safety of the Toyota, while his daughter tried in vain to ignore her parents' bickering. Logic belonged back on the East Coast, in a house that was coming apart at the seams. The field opened to a grove of trees, an oasis in the patchwork. Rick stumbled into it, and Marie collapsed on the ground beside him, half in and half out of the grassy hill.
5 is sickness,
she managed to say. Marie regained her feet. Her breath was sharp and jagged. Rick saw she was staring towards the trees and followed her gaze to the center of the grove. Her gasps grew shriller until they petered out into half sobs. If it weren't for Marie, he wouldn't have seen the animal staring at them. It stood several yards away, beside a cluster of small trees grown thick together, its body tense, ready to attack. Rick didn't know if it was a jackal, wolf, or coyote, but he understood why his wife was hyperventilating. He knew as soon as he saw the canine. Blood coated its muzzle. Rick yelled. It was instinctive, primal, no conscious thought, just a buildup of air and a compression of the lungs. It must have been menacing enough, because the beast, a coyote, yes, it had to be a coyote, darted off in the opposite direction. The animal didn't make a sound as it dodged trees and exposed roots, its tan body disappearing like a shadow in the dark. Rick and Marie stood still, staring at where the coyote vanished. Images of the dog snatching his daughter from the road flashed through his mind. He took a step, knowing a pack of coyotes might be watching him from the shadows. Then he took another, and another. Each one cautious, each one forced by whatever willpower remained in his body. When Marie spoke again, he wanted to turn around and strangle her, to tell her she was a lying bitch, but all he could do was let the immensity of her words sink into his flesh like an anchor.
6 is death.
Rick reached the spot where the coyote had been. He turned so he could see behind the trees and stared down. Then he crouched carefully and reached out a hand, but quickly brought it back to his side. He stared until tears blurred his vision.
He looked away, blinking at a tree a few yards to his right.
There, in the top few branches, were a bunch of crows, all of them seeming to stare at him with black, accusing eyes. Rick couldn't help it. He didn't want to. But what he wanted didn't matter anymore. It hadn't mattered since the car had swerved off the highway into the fields that were now his prison. He counted the crows and began to scream.
The Toll House by W. W. Jacobs. Performed by Otis Jiry. "It's all nonsense," said Jack Barnes. "Of course, people have died in a house. People die in every house. As for the noises, wind in the chimney, rats in the wainscot, are very convincing to a nervous man. Give me another cup of tea, Meagle." "Lester and White are first," said Meagle, who was presiding at the tea-table at the Three Feathers Inn. "You've had 2. Lester and White finished their cups with irritating slowness, pausing between sips to sniff the aroma, and to discover the sex and dates of arrival of the strangers which floated in some numbers in the beverage. Mr. Meagle served them to the brim, and then, turning to the grimly expectant Mr. Barnes, blandly requested him to ring for hot water. "We'll try and keep your nerves in the present healthy condition," he remarked. "For my part, I have a sort of half-and-half belief in the supernatural." "All sensible people have," said Lester. "An aunt of mine saw a ghost once." White nodded. "I had an uncle that saw one," he said. "It's always somebody else that sees them," says Barnes. "Well, there is a house," said Meagle. "A large house at an absurdly low rent, and nobody will take it. It has taken toll of at least one life of every family that has lived there, however short the time. And since it has stood empty, caretaker after caretaker has died there. The last caretaker died 15 years ago." "Exactly," said Barnes. "Long enough ago for legends to accumulate." "I'll bet you a sovereign you won't spend the night there alone for all you talk," said White suddenly. "And I," said Lester. "No," said Barnes slowly. "I don't believe in ghosts, nor in any supernatural things whatever. All the same, I admit that I should not care to pass a night there alone." "But why not?" inquired White. "Wind in the chimney," said Meagle with a grin. "Rats in the wainscot," chimed in Lester. "As you like," said Barnes, coloring. "Suppose we all go," said Meagle. "Start after supper and get there about 11. We've been walking for 10 days now without an adventure, except Barnes's discovery that ditch water smells longest. It'll be a novelty at any rate, and if we break the spell by all surviving, the grateful owner ought to come down handsome." "Let's see what the landlord has to say about it first," said Lester. "There is no fun in passing a night in an ordinary empty house. Let us make sure that it is haunted." He rang the bell, and sending for the landlord, appealed to him in the name of our common humanity not to let them waste a night watching in a house in which spectres and hobgoblins had no part. The reply was more than reassuring, and the landlord, after describing with considerable art the exact appearance of a head which had been seen hanging out of a window in the moonlight, wound up with polite but urgent request that they would settle his bill before they went. "It's all very well for you young gentlemen to have your fun," he said indulgently. "But supposing as how you are all found dead in the morning, what about me? It ain't called the toll house for nothing, you know." "Who died there last?" inquired Barnes, with an air of polite derision. "A tramp," was the reply. "He went there for the sake of half a crown, and they found him next morning hanging from the balusters, dead." "Suicide," said Barnes. "Unsound mind." The landlord nodded. "That's what the jury brought it in," he said slowly. "But his mind was sound enough when he went in there. I'd known him, off and on, for years. I'm a poor man, but I wouldn't spend the night in that house for £100. He repeated his remark as they started on their expedition a few hours later. They left as the inn was closing for the night. Bolts shot noisily behind them, and as the regular customers trudged slowly homewards, they set off at a brisk pace in the direction of the house. Most of the cottages were already in darkness, and lights in others went out as they passed. "It seems rather hard that we have got to lose a night's rest in order to convince Barnes of the existence of ghosts," said White. "It's in a good cause," said Meagle. "A most worthy object, and sometimes seems to tell me that we shall succeed. You didn't forget the candles, Lester?" "I have brought 2, was the reply. "All the old man could spare." There was but little moon, and the night was cloudy. The road between high hedges was dark, and in one place, where it ran through a wood, so black that they twice stumbled in the uneven ground at the side of it. "Fancy leaving our comfortable beds for this," said White again. Let me see. This desirable residential sepulchre lies to the right, doesn't it? Farther on, said Miguel. They walked on for some time in silence, broken only by White's tribute to the softness, the cleanliness, and the comfort of the bed, which was receding further and further into the distance. Under Miguel's guidance, they turned off at last to the right, and, after a walk of a quarter-mile, saw the gates of the house before them. The lodge was almost hidden by overgrown shrubs, and the drive was choked with rank growths. Miguel leading, they pushed through it until the dark pile of the house loomed above them. There is a window at the back where we can get in, so the landlord says, said Lester as they stood before the hall door. Window? Said Miguel. Nonsense. Let's do the thing properly. Where's the knocker? He felt for it in the darkness and gave a thundering rat-tat-tat at the door. Don't play the fool, said Barnes crossly. Ghostly servants are all asleep, said Miguel gravely, but I'll wake them up before I've done with them. It's scandalous, keeping us out here in the dark. He plied the knocker again, and the noise volleyed in the emptiness beyond. Then, with a sudden explanation, he put out his hands and stumbled forward. Why, it was open all the time, he said, with an odd catch in his voice. Come on. I don't believe it was open, said Lester, hanging back. Somebody is playing us a trick. Nonsense, said Miguel sharply. Give me a candle. Thanks. Who's got a match? Barnes produced a box and struck one, and Miguel, shielding the candle with his hand, led the way forward to the foot of the stairs. Shut the door, somebody, he said. There's too much draught. It is shut, said White, glancing behind him. Miguel fingered his chin. Who shut it? He inquired, looking from one to the other. Who came in last? I did, said Lester, but I don't remember shutting it. Perhaps I did, though. Miguel, about to speak, thought better of it, and, still carefully guarding the flame, began to explore the house with the others close behind. Shadows danced on the wall and lurked in the corners as they proceeded. At the end of the passage they found a second staircase, and descending it slowly gained the first floor. Careful, said Miguel as they gained the landing. He held the candle forward and showed where the balusters had broken away. Then he peered curiously into the void beneath. This is where the tramp hanged himself, I suppose, he said thoughtfully. You've got an unwholesome mind, said White as they walked on. This place is quite creepy enough without your remembering that. Now let's find a comfortable room and have a little nip of whiskey apiece and a pipe. How will this do? He opened a door at the end of the passage and revealed a small square room. Miguel led the way with a candle, and, first melting a drop or two of tallow, stuck it on the mantelpiece. The others seated themselves on the floor and watched pleasantly as White drew from his pocket a small bottle of whiskey and a tin cup. I've forgotten the water, he exclaimed. I'll soon get some, said Miguel. He tugged violently at the bell handle, and the rusty jangling of a bell sounded from a distant kitchen. He rang again. Don't play the fool, said Barnes roughly. Miguel laughed. I only wanted to convince you, he said kindly. There ought to be, at any rate, one ghost in the servants' hall. Barnes held up his hand for silence. Yes, said Miguel with a grin at the other two. Is anybody coming? Suppose we drop this game and go back, said Barnes suddenly. I don't believe in spirits, but nerves are outside anybody's command. You may laugh as you like, but it really seemed to me that I heard a door open below and steps on the stairs. His voice was drowned in a roar of laughter. He's coming around, said Miguel with a smirk. By the time I've done with him, he will be a confirmed believer. Well, who will go and get some water? Will you, Barnes? No, was the reply. If there is any, it might not be safe to drink after all these years, said Lester. We must do without it. Meagle nodded, and taking a seat on the floor, held out his hand for the cup. Pipes were lit, and the clean, wholesome smell of tobacco filled the room. White produced a pack of cards. Talk and laughter rang through the room and died away reluctantly in distant corners. "Empty rooms always delude me into the belief that I possess a deep voice," said Meagle. "Tomorrow!" He started up with a smothered exclamation as the light went out suddenly, and something struck him on the head. Then the others sprang to their feet. Then Meagle laughed. "It's the candle," he exclaimed. "I didn't stick it enough." Barnes struck a match and, relighting the candle, stuck it on the mantelpiece, and sitting down took up his cards again. "What was I going to say?" said Meagle. "Oh, I know. Tomorrow Listen," said White, laying his hand on the other's sleeve. "Upon my word, I really thought I heard a laugh." "Look here," said Barnes. "What do you say to going back? I've had enough of this. I keep fancying that I hear things too, sounds of something moving about in the passage outside. I know it's only fancy, but it's uncomfortable." "You go if you want to," said Meagle, "and we will play dummy. Or you might ask the tramp to take your hand for you as you go downstairs." Barnes shivered and exclaimed angrily. He got up and, walking to the half-closed door, listened. "Go outside," said Meagle, winking at the other two. "I'll dare you to go down to the hall door and back by yourself." Barnes came back and, bending forward, lit his pipe at the candle. "I am nervous, but rational," he said, blowing out a thin cloud of smoke. "My nerves tell me that there is something prowling up and down the long passage outside. My reason tells me that it is all nonsense. Where are my cards?" He sat down again, and taking up his hand, looked through it carefully and led. "Here, play, White," he said after a pause. White made no sign. "Why, he is asleep," said Meagle. "Wake up, old man, wake up and play." Lester, who was sitting next to him, took the sleeping man by the arm and shook him, gently at first, and then with some roughness. But White, with his back against the wall and his head bowed, made no sign. Meagle bawled in his ear and then turned a puzzled face to the others. "He sleeps like the dead," he said, grimacing. "Well, there are still 3 of us to keep each other company." "Yes," said Lester, nodding. "Unless, good Lord, suppose—" He broke off and eyed them, trembling. "Suppose what?" inquired Meagle. "Nothing," stammered Lester. "Let's wake him. Try him again. White? White?" "It's no good," said Meagle seriously. "There's something wrong about that sleep." "That's what I meant," said Lester. "And if he goes to sleep like that, why shouldn't—" Meagle sprang to his feet. "Nonsense," he said roughly. "He's tired out, that's all. Still, let's take him up and clear out. You take his legs, and Barnes will lead the way with the candle." "Yes? Who's that?" He looked up quickly toward the door. "Thought I heard somebody tap," he said with a shamefaced laugh. "Now, Lester, up with him. 1, 2. Lester? Lester!" He sprang forward too late. Lester, with his face buried in his arms, had rolled over on the floor fast asleep, and his utmost efforts failed to waken him. "He is asleep," he stammered. "Asleep!" Barnes, who had taken the candle from the mantelpiece, stood peering at the sleepers in silence and dropping tallow over the floor. "We must get out of this," said Meagle. "Quick!" Barnes hesitated. "We can't leave them here," he began. "We must," said Meagle in strident tones. "If you go to sleep, I shall go. Quick, come." He seized the other man by the arm and strove to drag him to the door. Barnes shook him off and, putting the candle back on the mantelpiece, tried again to rouse the sleepers. "It's no good," he said at last, and, turning from them, watched Meagle. "Don't you go to sleep," he said anxiously. Meagle shook his head, and they stood for some time in uneasy silence. "May as well shut the door," said Barnes at last. He crossed over and closed it gently. Then, at a scuffling noise behind him, he turned and saw Meagle in a heap on the hearthstone. With a sharp catch in his breath, he stood motionless. Inside the room, the candle, fluttering in the draught, showed dimly the grotesque attitudes of the sleepers. Beyond the door there seemed to his overwrought imagination a strange and stealthy unrest. He tried to whistle, but his lips were parched, and in a mechanical fashion he stooped and began to pick up the cards which littered the floor. He stopped once or twice and stood with bent head listening. The unrest outside seemed to increase. A loud creaking sounded from the stairs. "Who is there?" he cried loudly. The creaking ceased. He crossed to the door and, flinging it open, strode out into the corridor. As he walked, his fears left him suddenly. "Come on," he cried with a low laugh. All of you, show your faces. Your infernal, ugly faces. Don't skulk." He laughed again and walked on, and the heap in the fireplace put out his head, tortoise fashion, and listened in horror to the retreating footsteps. Not until they had become inaudible in the distance did the listener's features relax. "Good Lord, Lester, we've driven him mad," he said in a frightened whisper. "We must go after him." There was no reply. Meagle sprung to his feet. "Do you hear?" he cried. "Stop your fooling now. This is serious. White! Lester! Do you hear?" He bent and surveyed them in angry bewilderment. "All right," he said in a trembling voice. "You won't frighten me now, you know." He turned away and walked with exaggerated carelessness in the direction of the door. He even went outside and peeped through the crack, but the sleepers did not stir. He glanced into the blackness behind, and then came hastily into the room again. He stood for a few seconds regarding them. The stillness in the house was horrible. You could not even hear them breathe. With a sudden resolution, he snatched the candle from the mantelpiece and held the flame to White's finger. Then, as he reeled back, stupefied, the footsteps again became audible. He stood with the candle in his shaking hand, listening. He heard them ascending the farther staircase, but they stopped suddenly as he went to the door. He walked a little way along the passage, and they went scurrying down the stairs, then at a jog-trot along the corridor below. He went back to the main staircase, and they ceased again. For a time he hung over the balusters, listening and trying to pierce the blackness below. Then, slowly, step by step, he made his way downstairs, and, holding the candle above his head, peered about him. "Barnes!" he called. "Where are you?" Shaking with fright, he made his way along the passage, and summoning up all of his courage, pushed open doors and gazed fearfully into empty rooms. Then, quite suddenly, he heard the footsteps in front of him. He followed slowly for fear of extinguishing the candle, until they led him at last into a vast bare kitchen with damp walls and a broken floor. In front of him, a door leading into an inside room had just closed. He ran towards it and flung it open, and a cold air blew out the candle. He stood aghast. "Barnes!" he cried again. "Don't be afraid. It is I, Meagle." There was no answer. He stood gazing into the darkness, and all the time the idea of something close at hand watching was upon him. Then suddenly the steps broke out overhead again. He drew back hastily, and passing through the kitchen groped his way along narrow passages. He could now see better in the darkness, and finding himself at last at the foot of the staircase, began to ascend it noiselessly. He reached the landing just in time to see a figure disappear round the angle of a wall. Still careful to make no noise, he followed the sound of the steps until they led him to the top floor, and he cornered the chase at the end of a short passage. "Barnes!" he whispered. "Barnes!" Something stirred in the darkness. A small circular window at the end of the passage just softened the blackness and revealed the dim outlines of a motionless figure. Meagle, in place of advancing, stood almost as still as a sudden horrible doubt took possession of him. With his eyes fixed on the shape in front, he fell back slowly, and as it advanced upon him, burst into a terrible cry. "Barnes, for God's sakes, is it you?" The echoes of his voice left the air quivering, but the figure before him paid no heed. For a moment, he tried to brace his courage up to endure its approach. Then, with a smothered cry, he turned and fled. The passages wound like a maze, and he threaded them blindly in a vain search for the stairs. If he could get down and open the hall door. He caught his breath in a sob. The steps had begun again. At a lumbering trot they clattered up and down the bare passages, in and out, up and down, as though in search of him. He stood appalled, and then, as they drew near, entered a small room and stood behind the door as they rushed by. He came out and ran swiftly and noiselessly in the other direction, and in a moment the steps were after him. He found the long corridor and raced along it at top speed. The stairs, he knew, were at the end, and with the steps close behind, he descended them in blind haste. The steps gained on him, and he shrank to the side to let them pass, still continuing his headlong flight. Then suddenly he seemed to slip off the earth into space. Lester awoke in the morning to find the sunshine streaming into the room, and White sitting up and regarding with some perplexity a badly blistered finger. "Where are the others?" inquired Lester. "Gone, I suppose," said White. "We must have been asleep." Lester arose and, stretching his stiffened limbs, dusted his clothes with his hands and went out into the corridor. White followed. At the noise of their approach, a figure which had been lying asleep at the other end sat up and revealed the face of Barnes. "Why, I've been asleep," he said in surprise. "I don't remember coming here. How did I get here?" "Nice place to come for a nap," said Lester, severely, as he pointed to the gap in the balusters. "Look there, another yard in where you would have been." He walked carelessly to the edge and looked over. In response to his startled cry, and the others drew near, and all three stood gazing at the dead man below.
Blood froze from dark red to moonlight blue under the slap of Gore's bare feet. Each step took more skin off of the blackening soles and froze it to the sharp granite of the craggy trail. A week ago he would have run in the snow, but the hard freeze made the glittering crust like thin glass. Moreover, rocks don't leave deep footprints, just bloody ones. Gore hoped that whatever was chasing him couldn't track by the smell of blood. It had only been 5 minutes, maybe less, since he'd last heard its massive feet plodding along behind him, and most Arctic predators could scent a hair under 6 feet of snow. Gore ran faster. He was becoming too numb to feel the rocks beneath him. Soon he'd have to put his boots back on, or he'd start losing toes. Besides, the sure-footedness of being barefoot no longer applied once you couldn't feel the ground. The last thing he could afford was to slip, break a leg, and lay helpless for that thing. He crossed into the shadows of the pine forest. The moon didn't shine through the limbs, and even the white of the snow had disappeared from his pulsing vision. Feeling his way in the dark, he bounced off of something like a tree trunk and steadied himself. The tree was devoid of bark and had jagged edges carved into it. Gore sighed with relief. He leaned against the pole and began trying to navigate his frostbitten feet back into his leather boots. He would definitely lose some toes, but it was better than losing his head. As his eyes adjusted and his strength returned, he suddenly saw the grim, scowling face of a blocky creature hovering next to his. Chills that had nothing to do with the harsh winter shivered down his arms and spine. The face resolved further, lips bright red, eyes stark white. He looked away, despite this being the very thing he'd been seeking, like it could see into him and knew who he was. This pole with the carven faces was part of a forest all its own, rimming the edge of the northern slope of the granite butte. Dozens of images, evil faces on top of comical ones, mixed with animals and spirits, were all hewn into the trunks of sacred trees and placed as a barrier between the Klondike village and the granite butte. The tribal totems were said to protect the natives against the demons of the north. Gore hoped that was true, but not too true. He huddled in the fur coat he'd found on the headless corpse and counted to 100. Nothing moved but wraith-like wisps of snow in the icy breeze. The thing had lost his trail. He lit a match and the wooden faces sprang to life. With an uneasy hand, he patted one on the cheek. "You watch out for me now, Crow. You protect me, you hear?" The face didn't reply. As Gore walked away, he thought, "What kind of monsters do you protect against, you bastard? Hopefully not all of them." A bare spot against a frozen creek bed provided enough shelter for Gore to start a small fire without fear of being seen by the hairy thing. Tomorrow he would go into the Klondike village and ask for safekeeping. The Klondike didn't much like the tribe. They sensed something about the small cadre of white men that they didn't trust, but they were his only chance. They knew him in the village, had actually liked him once. Maybe that would mean something. Morning came with a cold wind. Gore hadn't slept much, but at some point he shut down his mind enough to forget about the tribe, and that boy, and that thing that he'd found in the cave. Or rather, that had found him in the cave. When he came to, the sun was just gleaming over the horizon. He'd only have an hour of daylight before it disappeared again, so he went toward the village. Snow had obscured everything so completely that he almost walked by the first lodge without realizing that it was even there. His hopes sank. There was no one inside. The village, which should have been rich with smoke and activity, was completely abandoned, silent. He looked around, but there was only stillness punctuated by long shadows creeping into the woods. Why would they leave? The Klondike rarely moved camp once they settled in for the winter, and this was an abnormally cold year. Before organizing the tribe with McTerry, Gore had spent several weeks in this village trading the sugar and tobacco with the natives. It was where he learned how to hide his tracks by running barefoot along ridgelines, how to dress all kinds of animals for food, and most importantly, where he learned to imitate the behavior of the Klondike people. A skill he'd thought useless until he met McTerry. Then, one day, he and the Scotsman shared a bottle of whiskey in Dawson and came up with the idea for the tribe. Soon they were jumping claims together using Gore's knowledge to make it look like Tlingit raiding parties. Business was so good that the tribe expanded to almost a dozen men before the winter got cold and things got bad. Then that boy and his sugar came along and made it all worse. The whole thing started and ended with sugar. Even in the boom towns, a man could be hung or shot over sugar, no questions asked. And the tribe wasn't nearly that civilized. Gore found the fire pit in the center of the village. It was a small depression in the snow, far smaller than he'd ever thought useful in the Arctic cold. The Tlingit used surprisingly little fire, he remembered. He went past the pit to the Elders' Lodge. The lodges to either side were only sticks protruding out of the snow. The hides that had once been stretched over them had been removed, too valuable to leave. The Elders' Lodge was still intact, though, and hopefully that meant there was food inside. The flap was crusted shut so that Gore had to cut around the lashings with his knife and pull off the whole hide like it was a solid wooden door. He threw it aside and lowered his mining lantern into the dark opening. The sun was already beginning to dim. As the lantern crossed the threshold, a face appeared in the center of the lodge. Gore jumped back, thinking that the thing from the cave had somehow followed him to the village. Knife still in hand, he stumbled backwards to a crouch and prepared to defend himself. Darkness fell over the lodge door, but the face did not emerge, nor did the beast come lunging out to devour him like it had McTerry and the tribe. All was silent. Gore went back to the lodge, this time focusing the light into the shadow slowly. The form of a man resolved itself in the darkness. The man was seated in a prayer position, one he'd seen many times during his stay in the village. The man didn't move. The frosted black face had been dead for a long time. Gore dragged the frozen body out into the dying sun. He was shirtless, painted for battle, a lone warrior left to keep vigil. But against what? There was something familiar about the red markings on the warrior. He wasn't the elder, nor anyone that Gore could remember, but he'd seen those markings somewhere before. He cleaned off the frost from the Tlingit's bare chest, and a symbol appeared. It was a familial symbol, belonging to an important tribal matriarch. The symbol was drawn with a finger into a deep, blood-red stain that had been painted onto the warrior's chest. Gore suddenly remembered where he'd seen it. It was the same symbol that the boy had painted on his face. The boy with the sugar. 10 minutes later, Gore had the fire pit dug out and had built as big a fire as he could find wood for. The frozen arm of the warrior, chipped off with his hatchet, was roasting above the flame on a pile of rocks. Gore's mouth watered with the smell of cooked meat, and he smiled at the irony. Like father, like son. McTerry was probably the only other literate member of the tribe, so Gore knew that the journal must have been his, meaning that it must have been McTerry's headless body that he'd found hanging from the tree, and McTerry's coat he was wearing now. His name wasn't on the journal, but that made sense. No one wanted to be associated with any record of the tribe's actions. With a full stomach, Gore began reading the words by the glow of the dying fire. He feared that the huge, hairy beast was out there somewhere, just beyond the protective ward of the totems, and the journal was the only key to what had happened at the cave. The only chance he had to survive. It began. November 22. It's already under deep freeze. Oh, this winter'll be a hard one. Can't return to Dawson. Most of the soldiers gotten off to fight the Spaniards. Thought this would be a good thing, but the Mounties are worse. Much more savvy. They don't fall for Gordon's ruse. They say these savages wouldn't take the miners' scalps. Gordon said no one would know the difference because most of the soldiers had been Injun hunters after the Civil and expected scalpings. Mounties don't fall for it though, and now they're looking real hard at us. Can't go to Dawson, even with the season's gold just waiting in our pockets. Damn fool, Gordon. Provisions are low, but we'll hit the miners' cabins soon enough. Time to get on the war paint. Gore skipped ahead. He knew this part. About how the miners had been smart enough to leave their claims before the freeze that year, and how they took everything with them. They'd only found one old hermit braving out the winter, and he'd only had a rack of fish and very little meat on his bones. After that, 2 of the tribe had made a run for it and tried their luck in Dawson. From what Gore knew, one of them had made the slip on an outgoing steamer, but the other was recognized and hanged before he got his first drink. Everyone else was too scared to leave and had holed up in a cave that they used to store their booty. All pickaxes and mercury bottles, but no food. Still, they thought it would be safe to winter in that cave. Even the Klondike didn't go up that mountain. December 3. Well, Gordy has redeemed himself some. Brought back an Injun boy coming from Dawson. Had a half sack of sugar. Not much, but an easy split. Moreover, the boy is still summer fat enough to make a decent meal. We let Gordon do his bit. Seems to bother him little enough. We call him Gore for a reason, I suppose. There was an awful amount of fat in that boy. Cave smells like grease fire, but ain't no one here praying for gourmet eats. God knows how these Injuns stay so fat, but God bless 'em. They do for a fine meal in a pinch. Gore thought back to the boy and removed a leather pouch of brown crystals from his pocket. Like a Chinaman stingy on snuff, he tucked a little sugar under his tongue and let it melt away the flavor of the frost-burned warrior. He hefted the leather pouch and lamented how light it had grown. When they'd taken it from the boy, it had a full 2 pounds. Then he noticed for the first time that the colored thread pattern on the side made the same familial symbol as was painted on the warrior's chest. Guess I was right. He began to muse, but was suddenly distracted by a sound from the darkness of the woods. It was faint at first, but soon Gore could swear that he heard a small child moaning. It grew louder. It was a boy. The boy. The sound became a groan and a huff. Kind of a low, repeating wail, but without the wind behind it to be considered a cry. He'd heard it many times, when a mine collapsed on a man's chest, or when he'd shot a bluecoat in the lung during the war. This one he knew intimately. It was the sound of the boy when he'd bled him out, cut his throat. They'd saved the blood, but no one could bring themselves to drink it, so it just spoiled. Now he heard it plainly, belching out of a split neck somewhere in the darkness beyond the totems. He felt the tingle of fear creeping up his spine, but pushed it down and told himself he was just shaken from cold and scurvy. The sound faded. Gore retreated to the Elder's Lodge with his knife and hatchet both brandished. That thing was out there. It was trying to draw him out, maybe drive him crazy. Is that how it got the tribe? He ate more sugar and tried to sleep. The totems would protect him. An hour later, he was shocked awake by another noise from the darkness. This time it came from the opposite direction, where he knew that the totem border was closest to the village. This time it was a different sound. Similar but more bestial, more savage, like cutting the throat of a bear or dying elk. It was louder. That thing may have only been 200 yards away, just pacing the border and taunting him with its devil voice. He pulled the frozen hide back into place over the lodge door, knowing that the flimsy walls would do little to keep out the cold or the demons that haunted it. The sound faded away so slowly that it was painful to hear. Then silence came, deep and sleepless. Gore lit a lantern. December 15. Injuns are tramping about round the base of the butte, making a hell of a racket. Started yesterday. They was calling out a name. The boy's name, most like. Then they stopped for a while. Buff went to check it out. Came back with a scare in him. Said they was by the totems with a bigger fire than he'd ever seen 'em use. The old one was sitting prayer-like, and the others was dancing. Now ain't none of that surprising. These savages get up to all kinds of hoodoo. One gets used to it. But what had Buff in a huff? Buff in a huff. Oh, is that he says they was communicating with the dead. God knows how he got that idea. Says he'd seen him talking to the smoke and that the smoke was talking back in the voice of that boy. Said he couldn't understand that gibberish, but he swore that one of the braves looked up the butte towards our cave with a real angry look. Then they all howled like devils at the moon. Whatever that voice in the smoke told him sure put a fire in him. Coward Buff ran back lickety-split, piddling all over himself. I say the lack of food has got us all a little loopy. Maybe we'll make a foray into the village soon. Get some more grub. A fat squaw would do just right. A bestial growl rent the silence. It was the sound that the thing had made when it lunged out of the cave at Gore. This time it was accompanied by a violent knocking on dried wood that was somehow more chilling than the moan, but only just. A few seconds later, a cracking sound like old timber falling in the wind came echoing through the darkness. The thing huffed once more in violent triumph and fell silent again. Gore turned the page with panicked fingers. December 17. Oh, Gordy's done it this time. We just held counsel and found him guilty of theft. We only had 1 pound of sugar left. Then suddenly we only had a half. Used 3 of these miners' gold scales we got lying around to confirm it. Pack inspection found half a goddamn stolen pound of sugar in Gordy's stash. Says he's innocent, that it was a frame-up. Oh, doesn't matter. Rules are clear. Some of the boys say that we should go easy since Gordy helped found the tribe and says we should just kick him out of the cave. Others say that's dangerous cause he could come back at any moment. Gordy says it's a fate worse than death. Frankly, I don't care, so long as there's one less mouth to feed. He's standing out of the cave and bellowing that he's innocent. That's a good laugh. Ain't none of us innocent of anything. In other news, the Injuns are back at their hoodoo down below the rise there. I think that's part of what's got Gore too stirred up to count his blessings and leave with his life. Sounds like they got a caged bear down there growling away. Don't know what they plan on doing with it, but 10 barrels of scattershot and a hungry belly says I hope they send it this way. Gore had stolen the sugar. He told himself that no one would notice, but that was just the hunger talking. Everyone knew exactly how much sugar they had left. He also remembered the growling, and it had indeed given him the shivers. When he'd finally given up pleading and left the cave, the noise had faded into the background, and he remembered breathing a sigh of relief. He never did see what was making it. He'd spent the next couple of days trying to make it back to Dawson, but when the snow came in thick, he knew he'd never make the pass. So he decided to turn around and try to make peace with the tribe. He'd eaten most of his coat, boiled it in snow melt and swallowed it fur and all. His teeth were beginning to hurt, and he knew what came next if he didn't find fresh food. But fresh food would be a long ways off. When he got back to the butte, he was startled to find that the trail up to the cave was red with frozen blood. It disappeared into the woods at the bottom of the butte. Despite his curiosity, Gore waited until the sun came up and devoted its precious short hour of warmth to following the trail. It abruptly disappeared right before the line of totems. He found there a decapitated corpse spitted on the branch of a tree. He took its coat, grimy and smelling of decay. Its pockets held only a journal and the leather pouch of remaining sugar. Then he went up the butte cautiously, slowly rounding on the cave. He didn't know it at that time, but he would soon be running for his life from the thing hiding there. The low, strangled moan of a dying man came from deep in the forest. Gore startled from his reminiscence. The sound droned on, intermittently interrupted by a choking sound, as if the gout of arterial blood were getting backed up in the dying man's throat. Gore froze, moving only his eyes to make sure that the knife and hatchet were still in his numb fingers. Why hadn't he taken a gun from the cave when he had the chance? The sound faded, and silence so profound that it was deafening fell over the darkness again. Gore edged forward, stiff legs protesting. From a gap in the frozen hide, he could barely just see out into the moonlight. At first, it was all just snow and the silhouettes of ancient trees, but his eyes searched around until they fell onto the corpse of the dead warrior that he'd stepped over to get to the lodge. "Never step over a dead body," he heard McTerry's voice echo in his mind. Superstitious, Gore had thought, just like all his kind. But now he wasn't so sure. Hadn't the corpse been facing the other way? And what was that glint in its eyes? The moonlight? But hadn't its eyes been shut? The sound of a man bleeding out through his own cut throat ripped across the silence again. Gore could have sworn that it was coming from the corpse, but his mind was so frayed that he couldn't be sure. He pulled back into the lodge with a stifled yelp, and the sound stopped. More knocking sounds came from the woods, like someone angrily pounding on the totems out in the distance. Another crack of dried wood and a triumphant growl. What can stop it? He thought desperately. Something has to be able to stop it. He turned up the lamp and flipped the page. December 18. God damn, what a night. What a goddamn night. All night through, those damn savages chanting away. That thing they got down there is growling up a storm. Buff went back down there an hour ago. Oh, he'd given him up for a goner, but he came back all a-twitter again. Said that thing they got tied up down there ain't natural. Said that only one brave is left there, some shirtless crazy fuck. Buff's gotta be delirious. Said he's the only one chanting, but there's the voices of at least a dozen men down there. Must be hiding in the woods. Of course, good chance we're all a little delirious. I'm gonna go have a look myself. I want to get a gander at this thing that Buff's all worked up over. Says it's completely hairy, like an ape from the circus, but that it stands on two legs like a man. I've never seen a circus, so I can't say. Said it's only a few feet tall, 3 or 4, and it's chained to a totem. That's nuts, because Injuns don't use chains. Says it stinks too. That I believe, because I can damn near smell it all the way up here. Like old garbage in a July latrine. The way it bellows is just... well, let's just say it's about time to put an end to it. December 18 night. Well, I got some good news. We got full bellies. That is, if we can manage to keep it down. We ate that hairy thing. First I got LaBouffe and we snuck down there real quiet like. Got within seeing range of that crazy Injun. And boy, do I mean crazy. You ain't got no idea. Feller had that big old fire going, and sure enough, that thing was chained up down there going a mile a minute. Like it was rabid or something, just like Buff says. I don't know how he saw us. We were real sneaky. Damn sure we hadn't made a noise. We've gotten good at sneaking in the tribe. We knows what we're doing. But some way that brave knew just where to find us. He stopped his chanting, all dozen voices of it, and looked up right at LaBouffe and me hiding in the crags. I hefted my rifle to put an end to it, but before I could fire, that damned Injun pulled up a bowie and clean cut his own damn throat with a deep, slow cut. Oh my God, that thing on the chain went berserk, like it knew what was coming next. You see, that brave looked away from us right before he did it. Looked right at that monkey ting, and they both got real quiet. The ting got all still, like it was afraid. Then the brave nodded to it, like they understood each other. Well, the next thing we know, gouts of blood are all gushing onto the snow. The brave fell down, shaking like he had the palsy, and the ting went to screaming and jerking at its chains with the power of 10 men. Damned lucky it was chained and not just tethered. So the next thing I know, I hear a loud crack next to me, and LeBouf had put a 50 ball right in that thing's head. Damned fine shot when he needs to be. So we go down the hill, and LeBouf is all talking about how he's gonna eat the monkey thing. Like he didn't even see the blamed crazy Injun just bleed himself out like that. To be honest, my mouth would have been watering too if it hadn't been for the stench. Oh my God, the stench! It's all about the cave now. But I guess it's better to be stinking than starving. Next, we start dressing the ting, mostly to get its head free from the chain, and the fire starts to burn down. But it's not quite out yet when that Injun elder overguesses his cunning, and I see him moving between a couple of trees in the shadows. I turn and fire, but go wide, and LeBouf gets up his gun. He pulls, and it clicks on an empty chamber. Damned fool was so excited for meat that he didn't reload. Anyway, I look back, and that crazy brave is gone. His body had clearly been dragged by some other Injun into the woods. I thought about going after them right then, but knew they'd have sport of us if we went into the woods. I'm not worried about the cave. We got half-ton of mining charges and more pistols and rifles than we could shoot in a week. They know they're no good coming up our way, which is why I figure they'd try and draw us into the pine. Anyway, LeBouf and I get the meat back here, and the boys damn near kiss us despite the smell. It was greasy, and I swear to God that the stink is coming out of our pores. But like I say when the boys complain, ain't none of us gourmet. Gore looked out of the gap in the lodge again. He hadn't noticed before, but it did indeed look like that corpse had its throat cut. The red of the blood glistened as though it were still wet. A black shadow dashed across the scene between Gore and the corpse. A strong smell of decay and garbage struck him through the gap like a bad wind. The smell was familiar. It was the smell of the thing that had been chasing him the previous night. It was also the smell that was so strong in the cave and on his new coat. What was it the journal had said? That stink is coming out of our pores. Gore sniffed the coat and winced. The shadow darted by again. This time, the sound of the Clinket boy bleeding out came loudly from just behind the lodge. Only the thin layer of hide and frost to separate them. It was deafening. Gore huddled in the middle of the flimsy structure, scared. He'd not known fear for a long time. Not when he was in the war. Not when he'd come north with nothing but a pistol and whatever gear he could rustle from the rushers. Not when the Mounties came after him for scalping miners. But now he was scared. He looked down at the journal. There were only blank pages left. What had happened at the cave? It couldn't have been that small beast they'd eaten. They said it had only been 3 or 4 feet tall. The one in the darkness was huge. Maybe an older one. A parent? An angry parent looking for its child? Shit! The smell came back as the lodge jolted, struck by a very large fist. I'm not worried about the cave, the journal had said. They know they're no good coming up our way. But maybe something else would have better luck, Gore thought. Then the brave nodded to it, like they understood each other. Not a lone warrior standing vigil, Gore realized of the corpse, but a sacrifice, a bargain, a life for a life, and now the thing knows how to find the ones it sought. The only language that makes sense to demon beasts. The scent of sin on the hunt. Revenge. He raised his hatchet defensively toward the door, impotent fear coursing through him. The lodge shook again. Frost fell around Gore like a dusting of snow. The sound of a child dying echoed through the darkness again. But not a human child this time. A bestial one, pierced through the skull by a lead ball. Then a long, slow moan of mourning that ended in a violent, angry howl. An anger so determined that it overcame 9 armed men, so keen that it destroyed the guardian totems, so final that it cost the people of the village whatever uneasy peace they held with the demons of the north. It howled again, and the sound of the frozen warrior's corpse, shattered by its great strength, tinkled like broken glass through the walls. Gore shook, the tent shook, and then the world exploded into a moonlight snowscape as the hide walls were rent apart. Gore screamed.
It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. Still, I will proudly declare that there is something queer about it. Else why should it be let so cheaply? And why have stood so long untenanted? John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick. And what can one do? If a physician of high standing, and one's own husband, assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do? My brother is also a physician and also of high standing, and he says the same thing. So I take phosphates, or phosphites, whichever it is, and tonics, and journeys, and air, and exercise, and am absolutely forbidden to work until I am well again. Personally, I disagree with their ideas. Personally, I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. But what is one to do? I did write for a while in spite of them, but it does exhaust me a good deal, having to be so sly about it, or else meet with heavy opposition. I sometimes fancy that in my condition, if I had less opposition and more society and stimulus, but John says the very worst thing I can do is to think about my condition, and I confess, it always makes me feel bad. So I will let it alone and talk about the house. The most beautiful place. It is quite alone, standing well back from the road, quite 3 miles from the village. It makes me think of English places that you read about, for there are hedges and walls and gates that lock, and lots of separate little houses for the gardeners and people. There is a delicious garden. I never saw such a garden, large and shady, full of box-bordered paths and lined with long, grape-covered arbors with seats underneath them. There were greenhouses, too, but they're all broken now. There was some legal trouble, I believe, something about the heirs and co-heirs, and anyhow, the place has been empty for years. That spoils my ghostliness, I'm afraid, but I don't care. There is something strange about the house. I can feel it. I even said so to John one moonlit evening, but he said what I felt was a draught, and shut the window. I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. I'm sure I never used to be so sensitive. I think it's due to this nervous condition. But John says if I feel so, I shall neglect proper self-control, so I take pains to control myself, before him at least, and that makes me very tired. I don't like our room a bit. I wanted one downstairs that opened onto the piazza and had roses all over the window and such pretty old-fashioned chintz hangings, but John would not hear of it. He said there was only one window and not room for 2 beds, and no near room for him if he took another. He is very careful and loving, and hardly lets me stir without special direction. I have a schedule prescription for each hour in the day. He takes all care from me, and so I feel basely ungrateful not to value it more. He said we came here solely on my account, and I was to have perfect rest and all the air I could get. Your exercise depends on your strength, my dear, said he, and your food somewhat on your appetite, but air you can absorb all the time. So we took the nursery at the top of the house. It is a big, airy room, the whole floor nearly, with windows that look all ways and air and sunshine galore. It was a nursery first, and then a playroom and gymnasium, I should judge, for the windows are barred for little children, and there are rings and things in the walls. The paint and paper look as if a boys' school had used it. It is stripped off, the paper, in great patches all around the head of my bed, about as far as I can reach, and in a great place on the other side of the room, low down. I never saw worse paper in my life. One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study, and when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in an unheard-of contradictions. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulphur tint in others. No wonder the children hated it. I should hate it myself if I had to live here in this room for long. Oh, here comes John, and I must put this away. He hates to have me write a word. We have been here 2 weeks, and I haven't felt like writing before since that first day. I'm sitting by the window now, up in this atrocious nursery, and there is nothing to hinder my writing as much as I please, save lack of strength. John is away all day, and even some nights when his cases are serious. I'm glad my case is not serious, but these nervous troubles are dreadfully depressing. John does not know how much I really suffer. He knows there is no reason to suffer, and that satisfies him. Of course, it is only nervousness. It does weigh on me so not to do my duty in any way. I meant to be such a help to John, such a real rest and comfort, and here I am, a comparative burden already. Nobody would believe what an effort it is to do what little I am able, to dress and entertain and order things. It is fortunate Mary is so good with the baby, such a dear baby, and yet I cannot be with him. It makes me so nervous. I suppose John never was nervous in his life. He laughs at me so about this wallpaper. At first he meant to repaper the room, but afterwards he said that I was letting it get the better of me, and that nothing was worse for a nervous patient than to give way to such fancies. He said that after the wallpaper was changed, it would be the heavy bedstead, and then the barred windows, and then that gate at the head of the stairs, and so on. You know, the place is doing you good, he said. And really, dear, I don't care to renovate the house just for a 3 months' rental. Then do let us go downstairs, I said. There are such pretty rooms there. And then he took me in his arms and called me a blessed little goose and said he would go down cellar if I wished and have it whitewashed into the bargain. But he is right enough about the beds and windows and things. It is an airy and comfortable room as anyone need wish, and, of course, I would not be so silly as to make him uncomfortable just for a whim. I'm really getting quite fond of the big room, all but that horrid paper. Out of one window I can see the garden, those mysterious deep-shaded arbors, the riotous old-fashioned flowers and bushes and gnarly trees. Out of another I get a lovely view of the bay and a little private wharf belonging to the estate. There is a beautiful shaded lane that runs down there from the house. I always fancy I see people walking in these numerous paths and arbors, but John has cautioned me not to give way to fancy in the least. He says that with my imaginative power and my habit of story-making, a nervous weakness like mine is sure to lead to all manner of excited fancies, and that I ought to use my will and good sense to check the tendency. So I try. I think sometimes that if I were only well enough to write a little, it would relieve the press of ideas and rest me. But I find I get pretty tired when I try. It is so discouraging not to have any advice and companionship about my work. When I get really well, John says, we will ask Cousin Henry and Julia down for a long visit. But he said he would as soon put fireworks in my pillowcase as to let me have those stimulating people about me now. I wish I could get well faster. But I must not think about that. This paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. There is a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck, and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. I get positively angry with the impertinence of it and the everlastingness. Up and down and sideways they crawl, and those absurd, unblinking eyes are everywhere. There is one place where two breaths didn't match, and all the eyes go all up and down the line, one a little higher than the other. I never saw so much expression in an inanimate thing before, and we all know how much expression they have. I used to lie awake as a child and get more entertainment and terror out of blank walls and plain furniture than most children could find in a toy store. I remember what a kindly wink the knobs of our old big bureau used to have, and there was one chair that always seemed like a strong friend. I used to feel that if any of the other things looked too fierce, I could always hop into that chair and be safe. The furniture in this room is no worse than inharmonious, however, for we had to bring it all from downstairs. I suppose when this was used as a playroom, they had to take the nursery things out. And no wonder. I never saw such ravages as the children have made here. The wallpaper, as I said before, is torn off in spots, and it sticketh closer than a brother. They must have had perseverance, as well as hatred. And then the floor is scratched and gouged and splintered. The plaster itself is dug out here and there, and this great heavy bed, which is all we found in the room, looks as if it had been through the wars. But I don't mind it a bit. Only the paper. Oh, there comes John's sister, such a dear girl as she is, and so careful of me. I must not let her find me writing. She is a perfect and enthusiastic housekeeper, and hopes for no better profession. I verily believe she thinks it is the writing which made me sick. But I can write when she is out, and see her a long way off from these windows. There is one that commands the road, a lovely shaded winding road, and one that just looks off over the country. A lovely country, too, full of great elms and velvet meadows. This wallpaper has a kind of sub-pattern in a different shade, a particularly irritating one, for you can only see it in certain lights, and not clearly then. But in the places where it isn't faded, and where the sun is just so, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to skulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design. Oh, there's Sister on the stairs. Well, the 4th of July is over. The people are all gone, and I am tired out. John thought it might do me good to see a little company, so we just had Mother and Nellie and the children down for a week. Of course, I didn't do a thing. Jenny seems to do everything now, but it tired me all the same. John says if I don't pick up faster, he shall send me to Weir Mitchell in the fall. But I don't want to go there at all. I had a friend who was in his hands once, and she said he's just like John and my brother, only more so. Besides, it is such an undertaking to go so far. I don't feel as if it was worthwhile to turn my hand over for anything, and I'm getting dreadfully fretful and querulous. I cry at nothing, and cry most of the time. Of course, I don't when John is here, or anybody else, but when I'm alone. And I am alone a good deal just now. John is kept in town very often by serious cases, and Jenny is good and lets me alone when I want her to. So I walk a little in the garden or down the lovely lane, sit on the porch under the roses, and lie down up here a good deal. I'm getting really fond of the room in spite of the wallpaper. Perhaps because of the wallpaper. It dwells in my mind so. I lie here on this great, immovable bed, it is nailed down, I believe, and follow that pattern about by the hour. It is as good as gymnastics, I assure you. I start, we'll say, at the bottom, down in the corner over there where it has not been touched, and I determine for the 1000th time that I will follow that pointless pattern to some sort of a conclusion. I know a little of the principle of design, and I know this thing was not arranged on any laws of radiation or alternation or repetition or symmetry or anything else that I have ever heard of. It is repeated, of course, by the breadths, but not otherwise. Looked at in one way, each breadth stands alone. The bloated curves and flourishes, a kind of debased Romanesque with delirium tremens, go waddling up and down in isolated columns of fatuity. But on the other hand, they connect diagonally, and the sprawling outlines run off in great slanting waves of optic horror, like a lot of wallowing seaweeds in full chase. The whole thing goes horizontally, too, at least it seems to, and I exhaust myself in trying to distinguish the order of its going in that direction. They have used a horizontal breadth for a frieze, and that adds wonderfully to the confusion. There is one end of the room where it is almost intact, and there, when the cross lights fade and the low sun shines directly upon it, I can almost fancy radiation after all. The interminable grotesque seem to form around a common center and rush off in headlong plunges of equal distraction. It makes me tired to follow it. I will take a nap, I guess. I don't know why I should write this. I don't want to. I don't feel able. And I know John would think it absurd. But I must say what I feel and think in some way. It is such a relief. But the effort is getting to be greater than the relief. Half of the time now I am awfully lazy and lie down ever so much. John says I mustn't lose my strength and has me take cod liver oil and lots of tonics and things, to say nothing of ale and wine and rare meat. Dear John, he loves me very dearly and hates me to be sick. I tried to have a real, earnest, reasonable talk with him the other day and tell him how I wish he would let me go and make a visit to Cousin Henry and Julia. But he said I wasn't able to go, nor able to stand it after I got there, and I did not make out a very good case for myself, for I was crying before I had finished. It is getting to be a great effort for me to think straight. Just this nervous weakness, I suppose. And dear John gathered me up in his arms and just carried me upstairs and laid me on the bed and sat by me and read to me till it tired my head. He said I was his darling and his comfort and all he had, and that I must take care of myself for his sake and keep well. He says no one but myself can help me out of it, and that I must use my will and self-control and not let any silly fancies run away with me. There is one comfort. The baby is well and happy, and does not have to occupy this nursery with the horrid wallpaper. If we had not used it, that blessed child would have. What a fortunate escape! Why, I wouldn't have a child of mine, an impressionable little thing, live in such a room for worlds. I never thought of it before, but it is lucky that John kept me here after all. I can stand it so much easier than a baby, you see. Of course, I never mention it to them any more. I am too wise, but I keep watch of it all the same. There are things in that paper that nobody knows but me, or ever will. Behind that outside paper, the dim shapes get clearer every day. It is always the same shape, only very numerous, and it is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind that pattern. I don't like it a bit. I wonder, I begin to think, I wish John would take me away from here. It is so hard to talk with John about my case, because he is so wise, and because he loves me so. But I tried it last night. It was moonlight. The moon shines in all around, just as the sun does. I hate to see it sometimes. It creeps so slowly and always comes in by one window or another. John was asleep, and I hated to waken him, so I kept still and watched the moonlight on that undulating wallpaper till I felt creepy. The faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern, just as if she wanted to get out. I got up softly and went to feel and see if the paper did move, and when I came back, John was awake. "What is it, little girl?" he said. "Don't go walking about like that. You'll get cold." I thought it was a good time to talk, so I told him that I really was not gaining here, and that I wished he would take me away. "Why, darling," he said, "our lease will be up in 3 weeks, and I can't see how to leave before. The repairs are not done at home, and I cannot possibly leave town just now. Of course, if you were in any danger, I could and would, but you really are better, dear, whether you can see it or not. I am a doctor, dear, and I know. You are gaining flesh and color. Your appetite is better. I feel really much easier about you." "I don't weigh a bit more," said I, "nor as much, and my appetite may be better in the evening when you are here, but it is worse in the morning when you are away." "Bless her little heart," said he with a big hug. "She shall be as sick as she pleases. But now let's improve the shining hours by going to sleep, and talk about it in the morning." "And you won't go away?" I asked gloomily. "Why, how can I, dear? It is only 3 weeks more, and then we will take a nice little trip of a few days while Jenny is getting the house ready. Really, dear, you are better. Better in body, perhaps, I began and stopped short, for he sat up straight and looked at me with such a stern, reproachful look that I could not say another word. My darling, said he, I beg of you, for my sake and for our child's sake, as well as for your own, that you will never, for one instant, let that idea enter your mind. There is nothing so dangerous, so fascinating to a temperament like yours. It is a false and foolish fancy. Can you not trust me as a physician when I tell you so? So, of course, I said no more on that score, and we went to sleep before long. He thought I was asleep first, but I wasn't, and lay there for hours trying to decide whether that front pattern and the back pattern really did move together or separately. On a pattern like this, by daylight, there is a lack of sequence, a defiance of law that is a constant irritant to a normal mind. The color is hideous enough, and unreliable enough, and infuriating enough, but the pattern is torturing. You think you have mastered it, but just as you get well underway in following, it turns a back somersault, and there you are. It slaps you in the face, knocks you down, and tramples upon you. It is like a bad dream. The outside pattern is a florid arabesque, reminding one of a fungus. If you can imagine a toadstool in joints, an interminable string of toadstools budding and sprouting in endless convolutions, why, that is something like it. That is, sometimes. There is one marked peculiarity about this paper, a thing nobody seems to notice but myself, and that is that it changes as the light changes. When the sun shoots in through the east window, I always watch for that first long, straight ray. It changes so quickly that I never can quite believe it. That is why I watch it, always. By moonlight, the moon shines in all night when there is a moon, I wouldn't know it was the same paper. At night, any kind of light, in twilight, candlelight, lamplight, and worst of all by moonlight, it becomes bars. The outside pattern, I mean, and the woman behind it is as plain as can be. I didn't realize for a long time what the thing was that showed behind that dim sub-pattern, but now I am quite sure it is a woman. By daylight, she is subdued, quiet. I fancy it is the pattern that keeps her so still. It is so puzzling. It keeps me quiet by the hour. I lie down ever so much now. John says it is good for me, and to sleep all I can. Indeed, he started the habit by making me lie down for an hour after each meal. It is a very bad habit, I am convinced, for you see, I don't sleep. And that cultivates deceit, for I don't tell them that I'm awake. Oh, no. The fact is, I am getting a little afraid of John. He seems very queer sometimes, and even Jenny has an inexplicable look. It strikes me occasionally, just as a scientific hypothesis, that perhaps it is the paper. I have watched John when he did not know I was looking, and comes into the room suddenly on the most innocent excuses, and I've caught him several times looking at the paper. And Jenny, too. I caught Jenny with her hand on it once. She didn't know I was in the room, and when I asked her in a very quiet voice, with the most restrained manner possible, what she was doing with the paper, she turned around as if she had been caught stealing and looked quite angry, asked me why I should frighten her so. Then she said that the paper stained everything it touched, and that she had found yellow smooches on all my clothes and John's, and she wished we could be more careful. Did not that sound innocent? But I know She was studying that pattern, and I am determined that nobody shall find it out but myself. Life is very much more exciting now than it used to be. You see, I have something more to expect, to look forward to watch. I really do eat better and am more quiet than I was. John is so pleased to see me improve. He laughed a little the other day and said I seem to be flourishing in spite of my wallpaper. I turned it off with a laugh. I had no intention of telling him it was because of the wallpaper he would make fun of me. He might even want to take me away. I don't want to leave now until I have found it out. There's a week more, and I think that will be enough. I am feeling ever so much better. I don't sleep much at night, for it is so interesting to watch developments. But I sleep a good deal in the daytime. In the daytime, it is tiresome and perplexing. There are always new shoots on the fungus and new shades of yellow all over it. I cannot keep count of them, though I have tried, conscientiously. It is the strangest yellow, that wallpaper. It makes me think of all the yellow things I ever saw, not beautiful ones like buttercups, but old, foul, bad yellow things. But there is something else about that paper. The smell. I noticed it the moment we came into the room, but with so much air and sun, it was not bad. Now, we have had a week of fog and rain, and whether the windows are open or not, the smell is here. It creeps all over the house. I find it hovering in the dining room, skulking in the parlor, hiding in the hall, lying wait for me on the stairs. It gets into my hair. Even when I go to ride, if I turn my head suddenly and surprise it, there is that smell. Such a peculiar odor, too. I have spent hours in trying to analyze it, to find what it smelled like. It is not bad at first, and very gentle, but quite the subtlest, most enduring odor I ever met. In this damp weather, it is awful. I wake up in the night and find it hanging over me. It used to disturb me at first. I thought seriously of burning the house to reach the smell, but now I am used to it. The only thing I can think of is that it is like the color of the paper, a yellow smell. There is a very funny mark on this wall, low down, near the mopboard, a streak that runs around the room. It goes behind every piece of furniture except the bed. A long, straight, even smooch, as if it had been rubbed over and over. I wonder how it was done, and who did it, and what they did it for. Round and round and round, round and round and round. It makes me dizzy. I really have discovered something at last. Through watching so much at night, when it changes so, I have finally found out. The front pattern does move, and no wonder. The woman behind shakes it. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. Then, in the very bright spots, she keeps still, and in the very shady spots, she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. And she is all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. I think that is why it has so many heads. They get through, and then the pattern strangles them off and turns them upside down and makes their eyes white. If those heads were covered or taken off, it would not be half so bad. I think that woman gets out in the daytime, and I'll tell you why, privately. I've seen her. I can see her out of every one of my windows. It is the same woman, I know, for she is always creeping, and most women do not creep by daylight. I see her in that long, shaded lane, creeping up and down. I see her in those dark grape arbors, creeping all around the garden. I see her on that long road under the trees, creeping along, and when a carriage comes, she hides under the blackberry vines. I don't blame her a bit. It must be very humiliating to be caught creeping by daylight. I always lock the door when I creep by daylight. I can't do it at night, for I know John would suspect something at once. And John is so queer now that I don't want to irritate him. I wish he would take another room. Besides, I don't want anybody to get that woman out at night but myself. I often wonder if I could see her out of all the windows at once. But, turn fast as I can only see out of one at one time. And though I always see her, she may be able to creep faster than I can turn. I've watched her sometimes, away, off in the open country, creeping as fast as a cloud shadow in a high wind. If only that top pattern could be gotten off from the under one. I mean to try it, little by little. I have found out another funny thing, but I shan't tell it this time. It does not do to trust people too much. There are only 2 more days to get the paper off, and I believe John is beginning to notice. I don't like the look in his eyes. And I heard him ask Jeannie a lot of professional questions about me. She had a very good report to give. She said I slept a good deal in the daytime. John knows I don't sleep very well at night, for all I am so quiet. He asked me all sorts of questions, too, and pretended to be very loving and kind, as if I couldn't see through him. Still, I don't wonder he acts so, sleeping under this paper for 3 months. It only interests me, but I feel sure John and Jenny are secretly affected by it. Hurrah! This is the last day! But it is enough. John to stay in town overnight and won't be out until this evening. Jenny wanted to sleep with me, the sly thing, but I told her I should undoubtedly rest better for a night all alone. That was clever, for really, I wasn't alone a bit. As soon as it was moonlight and that poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern, I got up and ran to help her. I pulled and she shook, I shook and she pulled, and before morning we had peeled off yards of that paper. A strip about as high as my head and half around the room. And then, when the sun came and that awful pattern began to laugh at me, I declared I would finish it today. We go away tomorrow, and they are moving all my furniture down again to leave things as they were before. Jenny looked at the wall in amazement, but I told her merrily that I did it out of pure spite at the vicious thing. She laughed and said she wouldn't mind doing it herself, but I must not get tired. How she betrayed herself that time. But I am here, and no person touches this paper but me. Not alive. She tried to get me out of the room. It was too patent, but I said it was so quiet and empty and clean now that I believed I would lie down again and sleep all I could, and not to wake me, even for dinner. I would call when I awoke. So now she is gone, and the servants are gone, and the things are gone, and there is nothing left but that great bedstead nailed down with the canvas mattress we found on it. We shall sleep downstairs tonight and take the boat home tomorrow. I quite enjoy the room now that it's bare again. How those children did tear about up here. The bedstead is fairly gnawed. But I must get to work. I have locked the door and thrown the key down onto the front path. I don't want to go out, and I don't want to have anybody come in till John comes. I want to astonish him. I've got a rope up here that even Jenny did not find. If that woman does get out and tries to get away, I can tie her. But I forgot I could not reach far without anything to stand on, and this bed will not move. I tried to lift and push it until I was lame, and then I got so angry I bit off a little piece at one corner, but it hurt my teeth. Then I peeled off all the paper I could reach by standing on the floor. It sticks horribly, and the pattern just enjoys it. All those strangled heads and bulbous eyes and waddling fungus growths just shriek with derision. I am getting angry enough to do something desperate. To jump out of the window would be admirable exercise, but the bars are too strong even to try. Besides, I wouldn't do it. Of course not. I know well enough that a step like that is improper and might be misconstrued. I don't like to look out of the windows even. There are so many of those creeping women, and they creep so fast. I wonder if they all came out of that wallpaper as I did. But I am securely fastened now by my well-hidden rope. You don't get me out in the road there. I suppose I shall have to get back behind the pattern when it comes night. And that is hard. It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please. I don't want to go outside. I won't, even if Jenny asks me to, for outside you have to creep on the ground, and everything is green instead of yellow. But here, I can creep smoothly on the floor, and my shoulder just fits in that long smooch around the wall, so I cannot lose my way. Why, there's John at the door. It is no use, young man. You can't open it. Oh, how he does call and pound. Ooh, now he's crying for an axe. You would be ashamed to break down that beautiful door. John, dear, said I in the gentlest voice, the key is down by the front steps under a plantain leaf. That silenced him for a few moments. Then he said, very quietly indeed, open the door, my darling. I can't, said I. The key is down by the front door under a plantain leaf. And then I said it again, several times, very gently and slowly, and said it so often that he had to go and see. And he got it, of course, and came in. He stopped short by the door. What is the matter? He cried. For God's sake, what are you doing? I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back. Now why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time.
Chilling tales for dark nights.